I have courses that I've been doing on areas of my expertise, the New Testament and history of early Christianity. And these are available at my just at my website. You probably know that, but it's bartehrman.com. You can go to online courses to have a bunch of courses. This course will be very different in some ways because this is really more about my personal life in relationship to my scholarship and not just my scholarship. One of the things I'll be emphasizing is that my scholarship is not what ultimately led me away from the faith, but I'll be talking about some issues of biblical and scholarship of early Christianity and other issues that will be relevant to my topic that can be considered as academic issues as well as autobiographical. Diane also mentioned several of my books, and some of the issues that I'll be talking about today, I do address briefly in some of my books, especially three of my first books, actually for a popular audience, Misquoting Jesus, God's Problem, and Jesus Interrupted, deal with aspects of what I'll be doing today, but I'll be talking about other things today and giving a fuller account. Right. So I am going to be sharing my screen, and so you will be able to follow along with my PowerPoints, and you will be able to see me in a little box. Don't worry, I won't feel too boxed in. Okay, I'm trying to share my screen there. I'm considering my screen shared. Right. I want to take that out. Good. Okay, great. This will be four lectures, the first one of which is called My Escape from Fundamentalism. So I begin with a little brief introduction about the strange world of an atheist New Testament scholar. That would be c'est moi. That's me, the atheist New Testament scholar. And I've got to tell you, it's a rather weird world that I live in. There are not too many atheist New Testament scholars in the known universe, but I happen to be one of them. I am a New Testament scholar who started out, like most New Testament scholars, I would say, as a person of faith within the Christian tradition. Eventually, I left the faith, and so there are a lot of New Testament scholars who have doubts about their faith because of their scholarship. Not too many of them that I know of have left the faith. I also know a number of people who have left the faith, and very few of them are New Testament scholars. Just being a New Testament scholar in a major research university, a secular research university, is not the most common profession on the planet. And I can tell you, it makes for rather strange conversation at cocktail parties. What do you do for a living? Oh yeah, I'm a New Testament scholar. Okay, what do you do with that? And then, but being an atheist scholar also leads to interesting conversation. You're on an airplane, and the person next to you wants to know what you do, and you say you're a New Testament scholar, and then they start talking about their religious convictions, and it's a little bit hard to say, yeah, well, actually, I'm not a believer, and they say, what? So, well, anyway, that's me, and it is a kind of a strange phenomenon. But I'm going to explain in part why it is that I'm both a New Testament scholar and an atheist. The goals of these lectures are to lay out one person's experience with issues related to the truth claims of the Christian faith. I'm not seeing these as definitive for anything or normative for anything. I have had a faith journey, as have many, possibly most of you. And I want to share my experiences as somebody who not only has had a faith journey, but has a faith journey while being an expert on the materials that are at the root of the faith that he's left. And so that's the idea. So the plan of the lectures is I'm going to give 4 lectures. The first lecture will talk about how I first became a committed evangelical Christian as a teenager, and then how I eventually, through my research, moved away from a kind of a fundamentalist understanding of the Bible to a different kind of Christianity. In the second lecture, I'll be talking about why I left the Christian faith altogether for reasons unconnected with my biblical scholarship in the second lecture. The third lecture, I'll be dealing with the disincentives I had for leaving the faith, the fears I had about leaving the faith. Many people who have left the faith have found it to be very traumatic, as did I. It was emotionally very difficult for me, as it has been for many people, and is for many people now, including some people watching and listening to this. My final lecture then ends with the question of how you can find meaning and purpose in the world if you now live in a world without God. For those who've never had God in their lives, that's possibly kind of a strange question to ask. But for people who are committed Christians, it is frequently driven into our heads that if there's no God, there is no purpose, no meaning, no reason to live. You'll become a nihilist, and there's no point in existence. Well, I want to address that in my final lecture because I don't think it's true. And in fact, I'll be arguing that even though I won't be opposing religion, and I'm not going to be trashing Christianity at all in these lectures, I will be saying that for me, leaving the faith has led to a life of more meaning and purpose. That's a personal experience, and that's not one that I expect anybody to try to replicate. We all have our own paths. So my plan is to have these 4 lectures, and what's not in the plan is, as I just indicated, my plan is not to try to convert anybody to my views. It's not to deconvert anybody from their views. It's not to make anybody non-religious. It's to talk about my experience as a way of introducing you to one person's perspective that may or may not be helpful for you. I have, in my life, I found it helpful to read other people's stories about their faith journeys, and so this will just be one of those. One guy's story. So that's the setup. So I want to begin by talking about my conversion to conservative Christianity. I emphasize the conservative Christianity because I was born into a Christian. I was born into a Christian household. I was born in Lawrence, Kansas, which had the virtues of being a university town, which had a big effect on me in many ways. But it was in Kansas, it was in the Midwest, and it was a very conservative state. And I grew up in a conservative family, socially, politically conservative. We were churchgoers, and I was indeed raised as a Christian. My family went to the Episcopal Church when I was growing up. And so I was not growing up a evangelical Christian. My parents, probably my mom at least, would have said she believed in the Bible, but it wasn't something we talked about. The Episcopal Church was a lot more about ritual and liturgy and worshiping God, saying our prayers, confessing our sins. I became an acolyte, an altar boy, when I was probably 12 years old or so, was confirmed in the Episcopal Church, and stayed an altar boy all the way through high school, and so was active in worship services. And so I was a religious kid, but not kind of crazily religious. And like you wouldn't have, you wouldn't have seen any difference in my life up through my, sophomore year in high school from any other kid, other than we were all weird in our own different ways. And so I did have a religious upbringing to some extent. I'd say that my mother was more religiously oriented than my father, although in the end, both of them became very, very committed conservative Christians. When I was in high school, lots of things happened to me in high school, kind of like you. Lots of things that happened to one. I had 2 kind of twists in my life when I was in high school that really ended up mattering for my long-term life. I'm sure I had many, many twists, but these 2 were ones that, as I look back, I think of as being particularly important. And as I've thought about it, I realized that these 2 shifts in my being were in tension with each other in ways at the time I didn't realize at all. But looking back, I see, yes, actually, these two could be seen as being in tension, and in some ways were. First, I had a new birth. I was born again. When I was 15, I started going to a campus life Youth for Christ group, which wasn't obviously part of the high school, but it was something that happened outside of high school. Campus life is it's comparable to Young Life or one of these other organizations that's not directly connected with the church, but is a Christian organization. This campus life group was run by a rather charismatic personality, a mid-20-year-old fellow who had graduated from Moody Bible Institute and was very gung-ho on the Bible and was insistent that that people needed to commit their lives to Christ and to ask Jesus into their heart and accept Christ as their Lord and Savior. In other words, be born again if they wanted to be saved. For him, being a Christian was not a matter of being born to Christian parents or going to church or being raised in the church. And in a way, it wasn't even like believing in the resurrection or believing things. It was about having a born again experience. This group I found very attractive because most of the time we weren't talking about God. Most of the time we're just horsing around and doing social events, and it was fun. And lots of kids from the school went to this thing, and so I felt like it was kind of a nice variety of other things I was doing in school. I was mainly playing sports and hanging out with friends and eventually girlfriends. And now this was a different thing, and it seemed kind of right and good to me. And after being involved for many months, I decided that I wanted to take this leap into to be born again and to convert. It's a little bit strange because looking back, one wonders, well, what was I converting from exactly? It wasn't like I was like a Buddhist or a Muslim or something. I was a church-going Christian confessing my sins and saying prayers and everything every week. But I considered myself to have had a born again experience, and it was an exuberant experience for me emotionally and psychologically. And from that time on, I considered myself a serious Christian. It didn't affect everything in my life. I was a not so serious Christian many weekends with my buddies, but in any event, I was born again. The other thing that happened in high school for me that was significant, it will seem equally strange to many people, which is I developed a passion for being involved on the debate team. Really? Yeah. Okay. So the deal with that is that I had always been a competitive kid. I liked sports a lot. I liked playing sports. I liked playing golf and baseball and tennis, especially. And I was, on the tennis team. I played baseball all the way through, that kind of thing. And I really liked competition. But I didn't, I wasn't really kind of built for football, even though I loved playing football, but I really didn't have the physique for it. I wasn't that good in any of these sports really, but there's another way to get competition, and that was on the debate team. And so I decided to join the debate team already when I was a sophomore in high school, and I was a debater and I was okay. But my senior year, I got really passionate. Actually, between my junior and senior years, I got really passionate about debate and just threw myself into it. Before that, I had been a good student. Fine. I did fine. I was smart enough. I wasn't, I wasn't particularly brilliant, or I certainly wasn't particularly hardworking. But with this debate thing, I started throwing myself into it, and I developed these study habits, working on the debate topic for the year and figuring out how to do research. And I just ended up loving it. And it was a competition. It was another way to win something. And so I was very active in the debate team, and I had really smart friends on the debate team, not so much on my other teams. I was on the debate team. Oh my God. So until about 10 years ago, I used to tell people that the smartest group of people that I ever had hung around with were these other guys on my debate team, and women too. There were women and men on the team. There were 6 of us who were kind of the 3 top teams, and we were all guys, and we won the state debate tournament. And I was really into this. The reason I say that these two things are in tension is because the whole idea of debate is that you look at evidence and you argue a case and you don't assume anything. And you try to show the flaws of somebody else's views. My born again experience was just the opposite. I accepted the authority of this charismatic youth leader and took his word for it and accepted the Bible as the authoritative word of God without examining it. I simply thought it must be true. It just seemed right, seemed like to follow how I assumed life was, but that isn't how you do debate. And so at the time, I didn't realize that these two were actually, my approach to these two things were very different from each other, but I was passionate about both of them. And those two things ended up affecting my life rather drastically. So getting serious about the faith. I couldn't get very much more serious about debate after the season was over, my senior year. And so, because, the season was over and that was that, but I did get more serious about my faith. When I was in high school, as I said, I was better than average student, but wasn't great. And I had no idea what I wanted to do for my future. I really didn't have an idea. I wasn't very imaginative. I didn't get much guidance. I thought I'd go to Kansas University. I kind of thought what I'd probably do would go to Kansas University and be on the debate team. That's what several of my colleagues did, including the guy who was my personal colleague in the high school debate. He and another guy on my team won the national debate tournament in college as sophomores at KU. So one of my ideas was to go to KU and debate, but I wasn't as good as them. I wasn't sure I'd go that far. So, I didn't have any idea what I wanted to do for a career. My father was a businessman. He was a salesman for a corrugated box company who was on the road a lot throughout Kansas, was very good and successful in his career. My mother was a secretary who was very intelligent and very bright and very analytical, but neither of them had academic interests per se. I had no thoughts of going on and doing academic work when I was in high school, and no idea what I would do. I thought I'd probably go into some kind of business thing or something and just live in Lawrence my whole life as some kind of businessman. But as I got more intensely involved with the Youth for Christ group, this leader of the group convinced me that if I really wanted to be a serious Christian, I wouldn't go to a secular school like Kansas University or even a private liberal arts college. I would take my Christianity seriously, and I would go to Moody Bible Institute, where he had gone, which he said was the top school in the country for anybody who wants to learn about the Bible. I'm not sure actually I am pretty sure how wide his knowledge base was about post-secondary education. I don't think he didn't have a wide database. But he was convinced by Moody because he went there, and here I went. I decided to accept his authority and decided to go to Moody. So I did. Moody Bible Institute. Once we were there, we would say things like Moody Bible Institute, where Bible is our middle name. It was, oh my God, yeah. This was hardcore Bible. It was a 3-year program, and so it wasn't a bachelor's degree. They didn't give a bachelor's degree yet at Moody, although they eventually started doing that. But they didn't then. It was a 3-year degree, a 3-year diploma. And if you wanted a degree, then you went to some other liberal arts college or whatever and transferred credits to get a degree. Because I was there for 3 years. And while I was there, I pursued both of my passions. I had, I had a passion for the Bible. And at Moody, when my friends were at places like Kansas University or wherever they went, they were taking classes in physics and in advanced calculus and in European history and in Victorian literature. And I was taking classes on the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Matthew, evangelism, apologetics, how you defend the faith. I was, and it was all that kind of thing, lots of classes on the Bible. And so I did not get a good liberal arts education. I mean, my first 3 years, I got none, basically. But I threw myself into it with the passion I had developed in my debating. And I just became a complete dedicated student. and just really went for it, and was, oh my God, I was crazy. I not like my friends who were pulling all-nighters at Kansas University by partying all night. I pulled an all-nighter once a week, studying all night. Outside of class, I would memorize entire books of the Bible, word for word, of the New Testament. I mean, just outside of class, I was just really passionate about the Bible. So I was passionate both about the study and the Bible. And so this is kind of the dual passions going together. My first semester at Moody, I was 17. I went there when I was 17. I was a little bit young, but I went at 17. My first semester, I had a class on the Gospel of John. And oh my God, this guy knew everything, the guy who was teaching this class. I mean, he seemed to be able to quote anything. He knew everything about the Bible inside out. And he's teaching this stuff. And there I was in the classroom about, like the third or fourth week, looking at this guy teaching. And all of a sudden I thought, this guy's teaching this stuff that I'm really passionate about. He's teaching that. They're paying him to do this. I want to do that. And so at 17, I decided I wanted to become a New Testament scholar, and pursued it ever since. I do not recommend people do that to make career decisions at 17. It happened to work for me. One way that my contraries of my passion for study and for debate and for argument and for evidence combined with my passion for the Bible and theology and witnessing to other people, and was in the field of apologetics. Apologetics is the Christian discipline of defending the faith on intellectual grounds and trying to prove that it's right. I was very much into apologetics at Moody, and went at length to prove to people that Jesus was raised from the dead on historical grounds, that the Bible really was inspired, that Jesus really was born of a virgin, that God existed. I mean, I had all of the arguments, and I used them because for me, this was like debate put into Christian service. Okay, so my move to moderation. When I graduated from Moody, I definitely wanted to go to finish my degree, and I decided I wanted to go to Wheaton College, which is a high-level evangelical liberal arts college in Wheaton, Illinois. It is a very good school. When I was there, they advertised truthfully that among graduates, so if you do kind of per capita, per graduate, the number of graduates who went on to do PhD work, the percentage, was the fourth highest in the nation of any university or college. So up there with the Ivy Leagues. It's absolutely true. It was true. And so I wanted to go there because I thought, well, I was competitive. I wanted to go to the best place. So I went there, and I majored in English literature. Didn't take Bible and theology classes because I'd been doing that for 3 years. I did take Greek, though. We had to have a foreign language, and they allowed me to take ancient Greek as my foreign language, and I really liked it, to my surprise. I never had been very good in languages in high school, but I really liked Greek, in part because, as opposed to high school where I just blew it off, I actually threw myself into it and just found it fascinating. And so I got really interested in Greek and studying the New Testament in Greek. That's why I took Greek, so I could study the New Testament. And I learned classical Greek, but then it started taking a lot of courses just, dealing with the kind of Greek that the New Testament's written in. And I decided, okay, so here was my decision. I was an evangelical. My first year at Wheaton, I'm an evangelical. I'm getting interested in Greek, and I decide I don't want to be another scholar among evangelicals. There are lots of scholars among evangelicals. I want to be an evangelical among the scholars. And so I developed the view that I wanted to go teach at a secular research university as an evangelical, teaching religious studies as a kind of mission, as a kind of ministry. And in terms of what I wanted my future research to be, I really liked Greek. And I especially was interested in the question of our Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, because I knew already at Moody, I knew that we didn't have the original New Testament. We have manuscripts, handwritten manuscripts by scribes who changed the text in lots of places, hundreds of places, thousands of places. And so it's important to figure out what the authors really wrote, because we don't have their original writings. We have later manuscripts that have been changed. And already at Moody, I realized this was a problem before I learned Greek, but I was completely sanguine that we could get back to the original text, and I saw the need for doing it. Because if God inspired the words, I wanted to know the words. And so I decided I wanted to study the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament so as to reconstruct the original text. And the expert in that field taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, Bruce Metzger. He was the world expert, one of the world experts, but arguably the top world expert on the study of Greek manuscripts. So I applied there and I went there. And boy, was that a different universe for me. A brave new world. It's a Christian seminary training Presbyterian ministers, but I had heard that, from my friends from Moody and then Wheaton, Princeton Theological Seminary, there aren't any Christians there. That was the line I got, and I knew that it was a liberal view of Christianity, and I thought, well, these people probably aren't really Christians, but at least I can study the Greek manuscripts there, and so I went. And when I went, what had happened to me at Wheaton continued to happen to me at Princeton Seminary, which is, at Wheaton, I took classes in history, especially intellectual history, which I was very interested in and committed to, understanding the intellectual history of the West. And I took English literature classes. I loved Victorian literature, especially 19th century literature, when authors, such as, the Victorian poets, especially Matthew Arnold, are realizing the problems of modernity and trying to wrestle with their Christian faith in light of the modern world. And I was interested in philosophical discourse to some extent. And I expanded my horizons at Wheaton because it's a liberal arts college, and went to Princeton, which wasn't expansive in a liberal arts way. But I took philosophy courses at Princeton with somebody who was from Oxford, did his PhD at Oxford in philosophy, and I got really taken with Plato. And one of the big things that Socrates and Plato emphasizes is the saying from the Delphic Oracle: know yourself, know who you are, dig into yourself and try to understand who you are. And so I thought, I need to think about who I am and what I really believe and what I really think. And I decided, I want to know, not just know thyself, I want to know thy subject. I decided that I really wanted to start looking at the New Testament in a deeper way than I had at Moody and at Wheaton. I learned Hebrew right off the bat and intensified my study of Greek, and took courses where we would examine the Greek New Testament and courses on the Hebrew Old Testament, studying it in Hebrew, and I really started digging deep. How deep were these courses? Well, just to give you one example, I did both my master's and my PhD at Princeton Seminary. One semester, I took a semester-long seminar on the book of 1 Peter, a book that I had memorized at Moody in English, word for word, but this was on the Greek text. 1 Peter is only 5 chapters long. We had an entire semester course on this 5-chapter book. And in this course, we only got through chapter 3. So, we really got into the Bible. And it wasn't from an evangelical point of view. My professors at Princeton were, almost all of them considered themselves committed Christians. Many of them were ordained ministers in the Presbyterian Church or in some other denominations. But they did not think that the Bible was the inerrant word of God. They believed that the Bible was a medium through which God spoke. God's word is in the Bible, but it's not a literally inerrant text that has to be taken word for word as what really happened. The Old Testament contains myths. The Old Testament contains legends and fables. The New Testament contains stories about Jesus that probably did not happen. The Gospels are at odds with each other. Paul didn't write some of his letters that are attributed to him. These were findings of critical scholarship, and Princeton Theological Seminary was very rigorous in terms of historical and critical scholarship, both in terms of literary scholarship and historical scholarship. At first, I completely rejected that view and put up the barriers and argued against it. for about 2 years, I simply wouldn't accept these critical views about the Bible. Things started changing in my 3rd year in my master's program, and then in a big way right before I started my PhD program. When my professors at Princeton Seminary would say, that there's a tension between Mark and Luke, that Mark has a different view from Luke, and in fact there are passages that contradicted. I didn't agree with them, and I could reconcile anything, and I did reconcile everything. I could especially reconcile big differences. And so if somebody would say the Gospel of John simply isn't presenting Jesus the way the Gospel of Mark was, these kind of big differences I had no trouble reconciling. What ended up getting me were small contradictions that showed me that the Bible could not be inerrant. I decided about maybe my 2nd or 3rd year in my master's program, training as a divinity student, a master's of divinity program. So this was a program training me to be a minister. That was the only program I could get into at Princeton Seminary. It's the only program they had, a master's of divinity. And so it included not just courses on the Bible and theology and church history. I especially liked the biblical theology course, the biblical interpretation courses, and the history courses. Those are the things I focused on. I had to take classes on pastoral counseling and on preaching and on running a church and things like that. But in the course of all that, I was thinking a lot about my theology and a lot about the issue of, is the Bible without error? Is it inerrant? And I came to a point finally where I just said, look, as a debater, I have to say that I can't decide the question ahead of time. I have to look at the evidence. And there are 2 options. You can start out, as I had done at Moody, you can start out by saying the Bible has to be inerrant. It has to be. If you say it has to be inerrant, then by God, it is inerrant. It's inerrant because there can't be any errors in it. And so naturally, if something looks like an error, it can't be an error because there are no errors. That's one way to approach it. The other way to approach it is to ask, is it possible that this book is inerrant? And look and see. There is nothing supernatural about an inerrant book. I mean, in theory, a phone book could be inerrant. It could be completely right up and down the line. That doesn't mean God inspired it. It means somebody didn't make any mistakes. And so if you want to know if a phone book is inerrant, you just look up your address and see if they got it right, or your phone number, and you look up, you read it and you see. If you want to say that any work of nonfiction is inerrant, you read it and see if there are mistakes in it, or if there are contradictions in it that can't be resolved, or if it just makes historical claims that aren't true, and you look and see. And in my case, that's what I decided. Look, I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to be open-minded. I know that if I work hard enough at it, I can get around anything. But, I can make anything so it doesn't look like an error. But is that really intellectually honest? I mean, are there places where actually there might be errors? And for me, it was the little things that ended up doing it. It's like you look for the smallest of all seeds. In Mark chapter 4, Jesus is telling the parable of the sower, the parable of the mustard seed, which gets sown in the ground. And Jesus says that it's the smallest of all seeds, but then it grows into a huge plant, and that's like the kingdom of God, the smallest of all seeds. Well, for one thing, by the way, that's not true. The mustard seed's not the smallest of all seeds. And you might wonder, well, why does he say it's the smallest of all seeds when in fact that's not true? And you say, well, look, who cares? Right, who cares? But why didn't he just say, look, it's a really small seed? Why do you say it's the smallest seed? Well, my beginning to doubt my faith involved the smallest of all seeds, little problems that I came to realize, look, I just don't think that you can, in all good conscience, reconcile them. In Mark chapter 1, the way Jesus calls his disciples is he finds them and he calls to them, and they leave their boats to come follow him. In the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't go to find the disciples. The disciples hear who he is, and they come to follow him. It's just the opposite. In Mark, they don't recognize that he's the Messiah until halfway through the book. almost entirely through his public ministry. In the Gospel of John, they recognize him as the Messiah on day one, the moment they lay eyes on him. So you can reconcile that, but boy, it sure looks different. In Mark's gospel and Matthew and Luke, Jesus cleanses the gospel, cleanses the temple, goes into the temple and overturns the tables and says, this is to be a house of prayer to all the nations, but you've made it a den of thieves. In the gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that's what he does at the end of his life. It's just a week before he dies, after his entire public ministry. In the Gospel of John, it's the first thing he does. Virtually the first thing he does is that he, in chapter 2, beginning a 3-year ministry, he does it. Well, which is it? I mean, you could say, well, oh yeah, he must have done it twice. And that's what we used to say. But is that really sensible? I mean, he gets arrested. I mean, why wasn't he arrested the first time? Why didn't he get in trouble the first time? And why, really? Just 2 times? None of them says he did it twice. If you say he did it twice, you're just making that up because neither of them says it. So you just, write your own gospel then. Jairus' daughter. In the Gospel of Mark, this synagogue leader, I'm telling you, I'm telling you examples that struck me at the time that I realized, yeah, this is hard to reconcile. This synagogue leader, Jairus, wants Jesus to come heal his daughter. His daughter's very sick, and he wants Jesus to come heal her because she's going to die if he doesn't come soon. And so Jesus says he'll go, but he gets delayed and he doesn't get there in time. And before they even get to the house, messengers come say, it's too late. She's died already. But Jesus says, don't worry. And he goes anyway. And he raises her from the dead. That's Mark's version. Matthew has the same story, but in Matthew's version, Jairus comes to him and says, my daughter has just died. Can you come and do something about it? Well, how can they both be true? I mean, either she was sick and then died before Jesus could get there, or she was dead before Jairus talked to him. It can't be both. Well, so these are tiny little things that are the smallest of all seeds. I mean, who really cares? Well, as a fundamentalist, I cared because if there's an error in a small thing, why wouldn't you think there could be an error in a big thing? When did Jesus die? Mark and John both give explicit dates for Jesus' death. In John's gospel, Jesus dies the day before the Passover meal was eaten, the day of preparation when they're preparing for the Passover. 19 verse 14. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus dies the following day, the day after the Passover meal was eaten. Now, some of you, for all of these, some of you are going to have your reconciliations ready at hand, and I get that because I did too. I could reconcile any of these things, but you just look at it honestly and openly, and these things were not in the Bible. It would never occur to you to try and reconcile them because they're different. Jesus dies on a different day. Well, when I was first thinking about these things, actually, when I was still at Moody, I knew that there were these differences, but I thought, well, you can reconcile them all. And one of the things I did is I bought a book. The book was called The Life of Christ in Stereo. And it shouldn't be stereo, it should be surround sound, actually, because the idea of this author was that you've got these 4 accounts and they're all telling a different perspective on Jesus, but they're all actually accurate. It's just they're each telling a slightly different thing. And so what he did is he takes the 4 accounts and he smashes them all together so that you get one big account with everything in it in all 4, and you see there are no contradictions, which leads to some very interesting resolutions. For example, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus says, in Mark's gospel, Jesus tells Peter at the Last Supper, before the cock crows twice, you'll deny me 3 times. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says to Peter, before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And in fact, he denies Jesus to different people in different gospels. So is it before the cock crows or before the cock crows twice? Well, it depends which gospel you read. But in the Life of Christ in Stereo, it's solved quite simply. Jesus was denied by Peter 3 times before the cock crowed, and 3 times before the cock crowed twice, so that Peter denied him 6 times. So I guess Jesus must have said, so before the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. Oh yeah, and by the way, before it crows the second time, you're going to deny me 3 more times. That's in none of the Gospels. You're just writing your own gospel. Well, who cares about all this? Who cares about these little tiny details? A fundamentalist does. And I was a fundamentalist. And these kinds of small contradictions are like small seeds that grow into a big bush. The smallest of all seeds ends up creating huge problems. I later found bigger holes in the armor, large discrepancies and implausibilities. I'm not going to go into detail for any of these things, obviously. I mean, all of these would take a long time for me to lay out. And I do talk about all of these instances in my various books, especially something like Jesus Interrupted. But the resurrection narratives, all 4 Gospels say that Jesus got raised from the dead on the 3rd day, but compare the accounts. Just compare them line by line, word for word. And man, there are differences. And some of the differences are just differences, but some of them can't be reconciled. Matthew is quite clear that Jesus appeared to the disciples after his resurrection in Galilee. They went home. They went to Galilee. You can just read this for yourself. You'll see it's quite clear. It's explicit. Jesus appears to his disciples on the day of his resurrection, on the 3rd day. He appears to them, and the entire final chapter that gives Jesus' resurrection appearances happens on that day, the day of his resurrection. He tells his disciples, don't leave Jerusalem until the Holy Spirit comes upon you, which will happen 50 days later on the day of Pentecost. And then he ascends to heaven, gives them a final instructions, ascends to heaven on the day of his resurrection. And they're still in Jerusalem 50 days later in the book of Acts, written by the same author, still there on the day of Pentecost 50 days later. They don't leave, and they don't even leave after that. Well, if Matthew's right that they went to Galilee, how can Luke be right that they went to Jerusalem? They're 100 miles apart. Kind of a big difference when you're talking about the resurrection. Jesus and John. Jesus is portrayed very differently in the Gospel of John, and I didn't realize it fully until after my 3rd year at Princeton Seminary. For 3 years in my master's program, I had decided to do a little experiment. For my first 3 years at Princeton Seminary, I read and studied only Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Because even at Moody, we knew that John was different, and people said it was different. And I thought, well, I'm just going to see how different it is. And the best way to do is to get it out of my mind, pretty much, just study Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so I did intensely, all 3 of those Gospels intensely, taking classes on them, thinking about them, writing papers on them. After my 3rd year, I sat down one day during the summer and decided to read the Gospel of John for the first time in those years in Greek in one sitting. And I did. I couldn't believe how different it was. Because instead of like reading the way we normally read the Bible, the way people normally read the Bible, the way I normally used to read the Bible is I'd read a passage from Matthew, then I'd read a passage from Luke, and then I'd read a passage from John, and then a passage from Mark, then another passage from John, and it all kind of sounds like it's the same. Yeah, well, it's not the same. One of the things that I discovered with the help of other scholars, a book that I read pointed this out, and then I realized it was true, that when you read the Gospel of John, you can't tell who's actually speaking. John the Baptist and Jesus and the narrator all use the same vocabulary and the same writing style with the same themes, so that they're all saying exactly the same thing as if they're speaking with the same voice. This author that I read asked, why are they all speaking in the same voice? I mean, surely John the Baptist and Jesus talked differently, and the narrator, decades later, writing in different language, spoke differently. Why do they all sound the same? And his point is the right one, because we don't have 3 voices in John. We have the narrator's voice, who is telling you what Jesus and John said and putting them in his own language. In the Gospel of John, Jesus spends most of his public ministry declaring who he is. I am the light of the world. I am the bread of life. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I'm the resurrection and the life. I am. Before Abraham was, I am. I and the Father are one. These self-declarations are Jesus declaring himself to be a divine being come down from heaven. Okay, that's fine. But I realized you don't get any such declarations in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Wait a second. I'm not saying that's a contradiction, but I am saying if these authors, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, knew that Jesus went around in his public ministry declaring himself to be a divine being come from heaven, why wouldn't they mention that? Like, that part's just not important enough to put it into writing? What, you just aren't going to bring it up? I think they couldn't have known. Why not? Because this is a Johannine view. It's a view of John, not of the other. Okay, well, so it goes. Lots of discrepancies, lots of differences, and not just in the literature, in the history. You start comparing what Acts says happened historically in the life of Paul with what Paul says about the life of Paul, and they're at odds with each other. I didn't realize that until I was open to the idea that they could be different. And in fact, there are numerous discrepancies, actual literal discrepancies between what Acts says and what Paul says. The early Christian record. The earliest Christian historian, Eusebius, paints early Christianity as a completely unified movement where everybody basically agreed with everything in the Nicene Creed, from Jesus and his apostles on for hundreds of years. Walter Bauer, in 1934, wrote a book that showed that in many parts of Christianity, the original form of Christianity was what was later declared a heresy that was contrary to the views that became orthodox. As I started to research it and started reading the ancient historical accounts in the original languages very carefully, I realized Bauer's right. Christianity did not start off as an orthodox religion. Christian doctrines changed over time. You can look at the development of the doctrine of the Trinity. I talk about this in my book, How Jesus Became God. There were different ideas, different views, and the view that won out was not a foregone conclusion. It happened because of a number of historical circumstances, not because it was handed down from above. The Trinity. The canon. How did we get the New Testament? I came to realize that it wasn't a divinely guided process. It was a very human process. We didn't have our 27 books of the New Testament named as the Christian scriptures until the year 367, 300 years after they were being written. And the reasons for deciding which books should be in and should be out, there were fights and arguments and debates, and it was not a foregone conclusion. It was a matter of serendipity and circumstance. I decided I had to move to a different kind of faith away from fundamentalism. I decided that Scripture was not an inerrant revelation that was word for word literally true, that in fact, getting away from a literal meaning led to a wider and deeper understanding of Scripture. There's a negative significance of contradictions. It's just sticking with the New Testament right now. The negative significance is that all of these accounts cannot be historically right if they contradict each other. They can't be historically right if they narrate different historical events in different historical ways. So they can't be historically right. But these contradictions open up the meaning of Scripture in a significant way, in ways I never imagined as a fundamentalist, in ways that most evangelicals simply never have recognized. If you see that Matthew and Luke are at odds on a particular point and you dig into what the difference is, it shows you what Matthew is trying to emphasize and what Luke is trying to emphasize, and you realize they're emphasizing something different and even contrary. It enriches the meaning because now you know what each author is really trying to say instead of pretending that they're all saying the same thing. Really valuable. It makes a huge difference for understanding the Bible. As a result of this, I developed a more open view of Scripture, but I continue to be a believer. I did not leave the faith for any of these reasons. I continued to be a Christian, but a more mainline Christian. And that's where I'm going to pick up in the next lecture. The two new states that I entered into then, at the end, I had an internal state that changed. I turned to mainline Christianity from evangelicalism, and I had an external change of state. I went to North Carolina. That's where I lost my faith. Okay, I'll talk about that in the next lecture. I'm calling Following the Truth and Leaving the Faith. So when I decided to think about my evangelical commitments, I had to start using my debate mentality a little bit. And you don't need to be a debater to do this, obviously. You just need to think, I want to have a reasonable understanding of what I believe. I try to have a reasonable understanding of everything else, of my understandings of science, of politics, of morality. I try to, use my smarts, and such as they are. And certainly I shouldn't check my brains at the door when I decide to believe. And so, faith should not, your religious commitments shouldn't be off in a corner someplace where you just kind of believe whatever somebody else told you or whatever you're raised with. You should use your head. And so that was my view that I developed, especially at Princeton Seminary, somewhat at Wheaton, and then it affected my life rather significantly. So to begin this lecture about how one balances reason and faith, I want to explode a couple of myths, which I think are myths that are widespread, and they are both, in my view, unreasonable, meaning in this sense, meaning that they don't meet with good solid reason and logic. So first, I'm going to start with a fundamentalist myth. I call this a fundamentalist myth, even though virtually everyone I know seems to have it, whether they're a fundamentalist or not. And it's because the fundamentalists have convinced people of this, at least in my part of the world, in the American South. The fundamentalist myth has to do with the relationship of the Bible and faith, or the Bible and the believer. This myth is that if you don't believe that the Bible is literally the Word of God and that it is infallible, then you cannot be a Christian. I hear that all the time. You don't believe in the Bible? Oh, you're not a Christian then. Oh my God. So we need to do an entire course on this one, because that is a modern idea that has never been what historical Christianity has said, and it doesn't make any sense. So when I say it's modern, of course, throughout the centuries, people who were Christian accepted that the Bible was God's revelation to humans. But the fundamentalist idea that it is literally correct, word for word, and has to be taken word for word, or you can't be a Christian, is just made up. If you know anything about the history of Christianity, as an example, you will know that the early Christians devised certain creeds that were to be said by everybody who was a Christian believer, and that these were the essential elements of the faith. And so you have the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. We believe in God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and so forth. None of these creeds says one word about believing in the Bible. And you say, well, these creeds, though, are based on the Bible. Yes, well, so were the alternative beliefs that these creeds were opposing. And the Bible in these creeds is not an object of faith. You do not believe in the Bible. You believe in God and you believe in Christ. Thinking that you have to believe in the Bible sets the Bible up as an object of worship. That's bibliolatry. That is not Christianity. Christianity is faith in Christ, not faith in the Bible. People say, well, but you don't know about Christ apart from the Bible. Yeah, you're kind of missing the point here. People knew about Jesus for centuries before there was a Bible floating around. And most people today know about Jesus not by reading the Bible, but by hearing about Jesus. Jesus is not the Bible. And so this is a completely fundamentalist myth that we can actually trace historically. We know where this came from. It came at the end of the 19th century, starting out in England with an evangelical movement in England in the 19th century that came over to America and grew big in America, as things do when they come to America, and became a dominant view among evangelicals. The view emerged precisely because at the end of the 19th century, Christians who were committed to the Bible were facing big problems from, for one thing, from the sciences. Darwin's theory of evolution, geologists estimating the actual age of the earth, but also from biblical scholarship coming out of Europe, especially Germany, which recognized that there are historical problems with the Bible, contradictions, errors, historical mistakes, and so forth. Fundamentalism emerged out of that conflict as a group of evangelicals doubled down on the Bible and started insisting that you have to believe in it literally, or you cannot be a Christian. This would come as a big surprise to liberal Christians still today. It does come as a big surprise to many who don't keep up with fundamentalism. And it would be a surprise to the vast majority of Christians who have ever lived that believing in the Bible is essential for that's what Christianity is. It's just not true. And so I know, the kind of scholarship that I do on the Bible, the historical scholarship I do on the Bible, is the scholarship that I was taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, a seminary that is training Presbyterian ministers. Every Presbyterian minister who has come out of that seminary, or virtually any of the Presbyterian seminaries, knows about critical scholarship on the Bible. It doesn't make them non-Christian because they realize that Matthew and Mark are at odds with each other sometimes, or that Paul didn't write the letter of 1 Timothy. So that's a fundamentalist myth that I really wish we could get over. This is one area where the fundamentalists have won the battle. They've won the battle because they've convinced people that if you don't believe the Bible, you're not really a Christian. And so if somebody starts having doubts about the Bible, all of a sudden they say, well, I guess I can't be a Christian now. That's crazy. That's what we call crazy speech. Second myth is from the other side, an atheist myth. I know a lot of atheists, and I get notes from a lot of atheists who say that people who believe the Christian message are obviously stupid or blind or just not very intelligent, because anybody can see that the Christian message is just bogus. And so atheists, I know atheists who say that believers really cannot be very intelligent. And oh boy, is that another bad idea and wrong idea and completely irrational idea. It is. It's irrational. I just spent this last weekend with friends from the U.S., both of whom are PhDs in the New Testament, who agree with me on most of my critical views of the New Testament. And they are ordained ministers, Presbyterian ministers, both of them, active in the church. They are smart human beings. I mean, Christian theologians. You think of someone like Stanley Hauerwas, or the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams. These people are serious intellectuals. And so I think both of these myths are spouted for reasons other than rationality. Some people just can't understand how you can possibly be a believer, but you shouldn't say that makes you more intelligent than them, because you're not. And so it isn't a matter of smarts. Being a Christian is not a matter of accepting an inerrant Bible, and being a Christian is not a matter of being dumb. Faith is not a matter of intelligence. Okay, so given that, I do think that it is useful for people to have a reasoned approach toward their faith. As I said, you've got a reasoned approach toward everything else in your life. You don't accept your understanding of finances and the economy that you had when you were a 12-year-old. Presumably, if you invest, you've got to have like a more advanced view. You've got more advanced views about just about everything in your life than you had as a teenager. Why not as a person thinking about religious commitments? Whether, by the way, you're a Christian, an evangelical or a mainline Christian, or whether you're a Jew of any kind, or a Muslim, or an atheist, you shouldn't rest content with what you've always thought. Just, it's not good for you. Don't do that. I tried to become an informed believer, and I tried to become one who was open to change. Realizing that, in fact, my fundamentalist faith may not have been right, my conservative evangelical. And so as time went on, I became more and more convinced that the scriptures of Christianity were a very human set of books, 66 books in my tradition, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New Testament in my tradition, my Protestant tradition. And I came to realize they are very, very human for some of the reasons I said in the previous lecture. One thing I didn't talk about much in the previous lecture is the existence of different manuscripts of the New Testament. I mentioned a little bit that this is what I got really interested in, and that these manuscripts all have differences in them. But as time went on, I started realizing that these differences really did have some effect on my understanding of the Bible as inerrant. As a fundamentalist, and even when I wasn't like a hardcore fundamentalist, but I still considered myself an evangelical Christian, I believed that God had inspired the Bible. Why would God inspire the Bible? Well, he wants to communicate his message to his people. So when I thought that the Bible had no mistakes in it, I thought that he had somehow managed in one way or another to make sure the Bible had no mistakes in it. There are different evangelicals have different views about how that kind of inspiration works. There's not like a set view that everybody thinks God dictated these words to the authors. I never thought that, even as a fundamentalist. We had different ways of understanding how God made sure there weren't mistakes in it. But the idea is that God wanted to give his revelation to his people without mistakes. But it's only after I'd studied the manuscripts for a while, for several years, that I started thinking, wait a second. I'm convinced that these things were like inspired without mistake, but why do the versions we have mistakes then? If God wanted us to have his revelation without any mistakes, why did he let the scribes change the texts? If I think that he inspired the authors to not make any mistakes, so he was controlling them in some way, why couldn't he control the scribes in some way, so that they didn't make mistakes? Because the manuscripts we have all have mistakes in them. Thousands of mistakes, hundreds of thousands of differences among our manuscripts, hundreds of thousands of differences. Most of them are unimportant. Most of them don't matter for anything, but still, why? I mean, if you read the Quran, manuscripts we have the Quran don't have mistakes in them. And I don't believe that was divinely inspired. Even humans can make sure there are no mistakes in them. If God wanted us to have inerrant scriptures, why don't we have them? That's not a slam dunk case against fundamentalism, but it sure raised the question for me, what's going on here? Why should I think that he inspired the words if I know that he didn't keep the words? What would be the point? I came to realize that the gospel stories about Jesus were based on oral traditions. And I came to think deeply about what happens to oral traditions as stories are told by word of mouth from one person to the next. Stories change, and they change quickly. Some people say that some conservative evangelical Christian scholars say the craziest things. They sometimes will say that, you couldn't have had a story invented about Jesus just within 30 years of his death, because they would have been corrected. You can't have stories made up in just 30 years. And I'm thinking, what is in their head? We all have had stories made up about us overnight. and we can't correct the stories. I mean, as a public figure, I have stories told about me all the time that are just wrong, including by conservative evangelical Christian scholars in print. And they could just call me up and ask if it's true. And I'd tell them, no, actually, that isn't quite how it happened. They don't even bother. So you can't say that everybody was correcting the things because, and that it would take 30 years. You couldn't do it in 30 years. Stories get changed all the time. And that I started realizing, what about the stories of Jesus? Were they changed all the time? I realized the Gospels had sources behind them. Matthew and Luke both used Mark, but they changed it in places, and they had some source we call Q, and they had other sources. How do I know these sources were reliable? Did God inspire them too? And we know that when Matthew and Luke copied Mark, they altered his stories. That story of Jairus, that story about Peter's denials, those stories are found in multiple Gospels. Authors are intentionally changing their stories in ways that are contradictory. Well, if we know that the authors changed the stories in ways that are contradictory, why shouldn't we think that the early storytellers changed the stories in ways that are contradictory? I started realizing, man, the Bible is a very human book. I continued to believe in it, but I believed in it in the sense that I thought God spoke through this book. As I became a more mainline Christian, I started realizing, look, the Bible does speak. It does give us insights into divine reality. I thought that, but it's not an inerrant revelation from the Almighty God. It's just not. It's humans who have really good insights. I began to realize more and more that the history of Christianity was very human, in the sense that there are things we don't know about the historical Jesus, and things reported in the Gospels about the historical Jesus that are not accurate, and that there are most things about Jesus we just don't know, and that some of the things we know he was wrong about. Jesus seems to have predicted, he did predict, I think, that the end of history as we know it would come within his generation. The apocalyptic end would arrive. That's why people need to repent. That's why he was so urgent in his message. The end is coming soon. The time has been fulfilled. The kingdom of God is almost here. Well, it wasn't. It didn't. That didn't make me stop believing Jesus. I still thought that he was the Son of God in some sense. And you say, well, how could he be the Son of God if he's making mistakes? Well, he was also human. Many people, Christians always say they believe in the incarnation, which is that Christ was a divine being who gave up his divine prerogatives in order to become human, and that he was fully human and fully divine. But very few Christians really believe he was fully human. Most say, well, he was God, really. At the end of the day, he's God. Well, but if he's human, he can make mistakes, like mistakes about the calendar. And so I continued to think that Jesus revealed God to us, but I didn't think every detail of what he said, would have been right. The canon, very human, how this canon got put together, as I pointed out, the theology that develops over all sorts of because of historical circumstances and accidents. Who happens to be the emperor at the time affects theology, for example. Christians have long said that this Holy Spirit was guiding the entire process. He guided the inspiration of the Bible, the formation of the Bible, the development of Christian theology, the formation of the Nicene Creed, the triumph of orthodoxy. I came to a point where I just didn't see it. If the Spirit guides faithful believers in their interpretations of the Bible, why do these believers all disagree with each other if the Spirit's guiding it? If the Spirit is guiding the formation of the canon of Scripture so they got it all right, why did he take 300 years to do it? I mean, those aren't slam dunk arguments, but they seem to me, it seems to be implausible to argue things that the Spirit is doing that just can be perfectly explained without any Spirit at all. I got to a point where I had very, liberal critical views about the Bible and about the history of Christianity. But I remained a Christian. I continued to believe that there is a divine being in the world and that Christ showed us the way to God in some way. My scholarship did not lead me to atheism. And my view is that biblical scholarship and historical scholarship logically cannot lead to atheism, because there is nothing inconsistent with an errant Bible and a flawed history that involves the existence of God. It is the craziest thing to think that if the Bible's in error, and if the Bible's full of errors, there can't be a God. What? Just try to think about that for a minute. Why would that be? What if there was a God who did not decide to inspire a Bible? Then why would an errant Bible show that there's no God? Who says that God has to inspire a Bible? Or who says that history has to be flawless in its development of theology? I mean, why do you think that? Well, because that's what I always learned. Yeah, I know, but it doesn't make any sense logically. Of course, there could be a God who didn't inspire the Bible. And so the question for me was not whether there's a God or not when I was thinking about all these critical issues. With the result that I taught critical scholarship when I was still a Christian. When I moved to Chapel Hill, I continued to be a Christian, and I taught pretty much what I teach now because the scholarship didn't affect my personal belief in God as a theist. What ended up getting me was not my scholarship, but the problem of why there is such intense suffering in the world. That's what ended up affecting my faith to make me leave the faith. I don't say that everybody should leave the faith because of the problem of suffering, but it's what did it to me, and has done it to many people. And I want to explain how it happened to me and to talk about this for the rest of this lecture. In 1984, when I was still writing my dissertation, I began teaching at Rutgers University, and I had to teach whichever classes they told me to teach. I was an adjunct professor there, didn't have a tenure track position. One semester, the chair of the department asked me if I'd be willing to teach a class that was on the books that was called The Problem of Suffering in the Biblical Tradition. I wanted to teach the class once I heard about it because I thought it was perfect for many of my interests. So my interest for a long time had shown me that the Bible is a variegated book with 66 different books written by different authors with different views, different perspectives, sometimes contradictory to one another, that it wasn't one book, but it was 66 books. Moreover, I thought that virtually all of the authors in one way or another, virtually all of the authors in one way or another are dealing with the problem that people today call theodicy. The biblical authors would not have called this theodicy. They would not have been thinking like we do about the problem of theodicy, but they're dealing with this problem of theodicy. The problem of theodicy is why there can be evil and suffering in the world if there's a God in charge of it. If there's a good and powerful God in charge of the world, why is there suffering? The term theodicy was invented by Leibniz, the German philosopher Leibniz, in a book that was called this, Theodicy, in the early 18th century. He took the term from two Greek words, which means theos is God, T-H-E-O is the word for God in Greek, and diki comes from the Greek word dikaia, which means justice or righteousness. And so theodicy is the question of the justice of God or the righteousness of God. How can God be righteous if there's suffering in the world? How do you explain the existence of God given the nature of things here? This is a question that Enlightenment scholars pursued with some rigor, including Leibniz in his book had an explanation that many people today would still find satisfactory, but many people would not. I decided to teach this class, and the class wasn't about philosophical discourse through the Enlightenment down till today. It wasn't really supposed to be about theologians and what theologians today would say about this problem of suffering. It was a problem with what the Bible had to say about suffering. So it was a little bit difficult to teach this to 19-year-olds, precisely because most of them didn't think there was a problem with suffering. What's the problem? So these were 19-year-old students in New Jersey, most of them middle-class kids, and they really hadn't just thought much about this problem. And so part of this was I was trying to introduce them to what the problem was, the problem of suffering. And here's the way that traditionally philosophers in the modern period have expressed the problem of theodicy. They sometimes express it as an actual logical problem. An actual logical problem. The logical problem is this, that there are three statements that on the surface, each seems to be true, but when you put them together, there appears to be a contradiction. How can there be a contradiction if all three are true? But how can all three be true if there's a contradiction? That's the problem. The classical statement of theodicy are these three statements. First, that God is all powerful. Okay, God's omnipotent. Traditional within Christianity, God can do anything He wants. Of course, He can do miracles. He can, have His Son die for the sins of the world. He can, multiply loaves. He can heal the sick. He can raise the dead. He's God. He created the world. He can do whatever He wants. God's almighty. Second statement, God is loving. God cares for people. He's not remote. He's not evil. He is good, and He wants the best for people. Okay? God is almighty. God is loving. Third statement, there is suffering. Why do people suffer? If God is almighty, He can make sure they don't suffer. And if He's loving, He wants to make sure they don't suffer. He wants the best for people. So He can prevent suffering, and He wants to prevent suffering, and yet suffering is not prevented. People solve this logical problem in a variety of ways, as you probably know. One way is to deny one of the three statements. You can deny that God is almighty. Well, He's not all powerful. There's some things He can't do. Second, you could say, well, God's not really loving. He might be indifferent, or He might be loving and severe both, or maybe He's evil. You deny the second statement. Or some people even deny the third statement, that there's actually suffering. I have least respect for those people, frankly, because I think they're, got their heads in the sand like an ostrich. Just look around sometime. Okay, so anyway, one way is to deny one of the three statements, which usually doesn't get you very far if you're within the Christian tradition, because in the Christian tradition, God is loving and God is all powerful. So you have to explain suffering. So what you do then is you come up with a mitigating circumstance to explain why they're suffering. And so you come up with explanations for how all three can be true. Everybody has free will, and if you've got free will, then you can hurt somebody else. And if God stops you from doing that, then you don't have free will. If you don't have free will, you're a robot. God doesn't want robots. He wants humans. He wants people with free will. And so, of course, you can make suffering. Okay, so that explains it, kind of, in the opinion. Kind of. People think it does. So you come up with explanation. God is testing us. God makes us suffer to test us and to see if we'll remain faithful. Okay, so you come up with your mitigating circumstances or your explanations. So this class wasn't about the philosophical discourse, but about the biblical discourse. And in the class, we went through key biblical explanations of suffering, which many of which are at odds with each other. And so, for example, in the prophets of the Old Testament, most people who read Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, most Christians who read those books don't really read the books. They pick verses that seem to be predicting that Jesus is going to come, and that's what they read. Or they read them for the personal edification, but they don't really read what the author's saying. In all of these prophets, those prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, all of these prophets, all of them, page after page after page, say that God is powerful. God is loving. And the reason you're suffering, you Israelites are suffering, is because you've sinned. God's punishing you. And so if you just repent and turn back to God, things will be good. You won't suffer anymore. So that's one explanation, that you suffer for your wrongdoing. It's punishment. The book of Job, I have here Job with a 1 above it. Job, unknown to most people, is actually two sets of writings that have been combined into one big set of writings. The beginning and end of Job is a prose story about this righteous man, Job, that God tests at the instigation of the adversary, Satan. He's the adversary, not Satan. He's not the adversary of God. He's like, he plays devil's advocate in order to see, especially the opponent of Job and other humans. God allows Satan to make Job's fantastic life miserable, and Satan does it, and it's a way to see whether Job will remain faithful or not. So it's just a test. That's why there's such terrible suffering for Job, which, by the way, includes Job's 7 children getting murdered, being killed, to test whether Job will remain faithful or not. And to make it up to him at the end, God gives him 7 more children. Sometimes biblical authors, as in the book of Genesis, portray suffering as a source of ultimate good. Sometimes something happens to you and it seems horrible, it's terrible, and in the end, it works out for the best. This is what happens with Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph gets sold into slavery in Egypt. Oh my God. But because of that, he ends up rising through the ranks of the Egyptian administration and ends up being the one who saves the nation of Israel from destruction by starvation. So something good comes out of it. Some authors think that it's all completely senseless. We don't know why it's happening. We don't know what's happening. This life is short. It's painful. Eat, drink, and be merry. While you can. Enjoy it while you can, because it ain't going to last long. Some authors, like the book of Job 2, which is the poetry in chapters 3 through 40, the vast majority of the book is Job having a discussion with his 3 friends about why they're suffering, why he's suffering. His 3 friends say that he's suffering because he's disobeyed God and God's punishing him. And Job argues, look, I haven't done anything. They don't agree. They go back and forth. At the end, God shows up and lets Job, he doesn't let Job defend himself. Job wants to defend himself before God, but God shows up and doesn't let him defend himself. He instead wows Job with his almighty presence and leaves him groveling in the dirt because God is almighty. And what reason do you have to question me? Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Do you know where the hail comes from? Do you know what the heavens are like? Who are you? You have no right to question me. And Job then repents of questioning him and writhes in the dirt. The New Testament has a very different view. The New Testament view, you find it in John the Baptist, you find it in Paul, you find it in Jesus, you find it in the book of Revelation, you find it almost everywhere in the New Testament, is that the reason there's suffering in the world is because there are powers of evil that are in control of this world and are making life miserable for people. But that God will eventually intervene, take these forces of evil out of existence, and reward his followers with good life forever and ever. Okay, well, these are all, if you want to see these played out, you can obviously read the Bible. My book, God's Problem, has a chapter devoted to these. Some of these problems are found a lot in the Bible, and to those I devote 2 chapters. So you can see kind of how that works. This class was about these biblical explanations, and we did other things in the class. I had them read other books. I had them read Harold Kushner's famous book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People, where Kushner explains that the reason people suffer, even though there's a loving God in the world, is because God's not all powerful. His hands are tied. He wishes he could help you, but sorry, he can't. And so that's his explanation. My students didn't like this book very well when I taught this class. They started calling it When Bad Books Are Written by Good People. Harold Kushner's a rabbi. He really is a good person, very wise. But they thought, just read the book of Job. This is not what the book of Job says. They read Night, which is, if you haven't read these books, you need to read these books. Night is Elie Wiesel's very famous book about his experiences as a teenager in Auschwitz and with his father, and a very, very powerful book. I guess it won a Pulitzer Prize, this book. J.B. by Archibald MacLeish, won a Tony Award. It's a play about Job, J.B., Job, and a retelling of the Job story in a modern idiom. Very, very interesting book, play, short. In addition to that, in the class, we talked about other things. We didn't talk a lot about philosophy, but we did talk about how people use free will to explain why there must be suffering. I'll give you one problem with the free will explanation, by the way, that we talked about in my class, which is that, people say God must allow free will. Otherwise, we can't be human. We'd be robots, we'd be programmed. And so there has to be suffering if there's free will. When somebody tells me that, I ask them, do you think there'll be free will in heaven? And they say, well, yeah, of course. Then I say, do you think there'll be suffering in heaven? Well, no. Okay, then you're saying that it is possible to have free will without suffering. So, so don't tell me there has to be suffering if there's free will. A lot of people say that the reason there's suffering in the world is not one of these biblical reasons, but it's motivation to action. I get this from hordes of people who say, look, the reason they're suffering is so that we'll be motivated to go out and solve it. And I think I agree. Oh my God, yes, that's what we ought to do. I don't think we can have an explanation for what's going on with all of this suffering in the world if we believe in God, but we certainly can have a response. You can have a response without knowing the explanation. The response is do something, and we should. This doesn't answer the problem, though. We can solve starvation today if we had the political will. Of course, we could feed everybody on the planet. Of course, we could. If we wanted to, we don't want to. We have other things we'd rather do. But how long have we been able to feed everybody on the planet? I mean, for tens of thousands of years, there was no possibility in the universe. No, you couldn't do it. You know, maybe the last 100 years is possible, 50 years, it's possible, but it wasn't before then. So why was God allowing it then? So the motivation to action, well, yes, that's right, but that's a recent thing. The problem of suffering is it's been around forever. Okay, well, so anyway, I ended up writing this book, God's Problem, where I explained these various views and I explained how problematic I thought all of they were. I decided to write the book right after I taught the class. This is 1984. I was like 30 years old, 1985. You know, God, this is interesting. I think I'll write a book. Then I thought, wait a second. Wait, I'm 30 years old. What do I know about suffering? Nothing. I mean, I'm 30 years old. I thought, okay, I better wait a while. If I'm going to write a book, it has to be down the line. And yeah, well, when am I going to be wise enough to write a book on suffering? Answer, never. It's not a problem we're ever going to understand, able to solve. So I did wait a few decades, but I did write the book eventually. Meantime, I took seriously what I take to be senseless suffering. When I was a pastor of the Princeton Baptist Church during my PhD, I was a pastor of an American Baptist church for a year, preaching every Sunday, doing the things pastors do, funerals, weddings, hospital visitation, dealing with people, couple in the family, 17-year-old son committed suicide. You say, well, yeah, you know, it's not no one's fault. He just decided to do that. Yeah, but the horrible, horrible pain of parents whose child commits suicide. Oh my God, where do you even start? Birth defects. Children born sometimes in pain forever. Why? Why? Earthquakes and mudslides. When I was teaching this class at Rutgers, one morning I got up, like the morning I was going off to teach the class, there had been this mudslide in Colombia that overnight it had happened. It killed 30,000 people. Well, they shouldn't have been living near that volcano. The helpful explanation, isn't it? Shouldn't be living where there's an earthquake. Shouldn't be living where there's a hurricane. Shouldn't be living where there's a flood. You know, it's not really free will. It causes mudslides. Epidemics. Well, we just came through one. So I just checked yesterday. According to the World Health Organization, about 7 million people died. COVID. Those are the ones that are reported. It's surely way underreported. The 1918 flu epidemic killed something between 50 and 100 million people. 50 and 100 million. And far worse was the Black Death in the 14th century. 75 to 200 million people died. Starvation. Every day there are about 10,000 children who die of starvation. Free will? No. Is God trying to make them a better person? No. Unclean water? Today, the current figures are that 3.5 million people die every year because they drink unclean water, etc., etc. When I was taking all of this very seriously and thinking through it, and trying to understand how can there be a God if this is happening, I had believed in a God who intervened, a God who is active in the world, a God who answered prayer. This was the Christian God. God was active throughout the Bible, throughout the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus. He leads the children of Israel out of their slavery in Egypt. He does miracles throughout the Bible. You come to the New Testament, God is active. He answers prayer. Jesus says he'll answer any prayer you say in his name. He has his son die for the sins of the world, an intervention to save us. And afterwards, he does miracles through the apostles. Great. It's fantastic. God is active and he's alive. He wants to help us because he's loving. He can because he's powerful. All we have to do is ask, right? Unless you're one of the 10,000 children who've died since 24 hours ago, or the 10,000 are going to die by this time tomorrow, who've asked. I got to a point. I don't believe it. I just don't believe it. Whenever I talk about this problem of suffering, I always get tons of emails from people trying to explain it to me. And I get it. I get it. We have to have explanations, but really, I personally don't believe it. I've had several debates with scholars since I wrote the book. Oh, we have some bright intellectuals with great answers for why there's suffering in the world. I did a debate with Dinesh D'Souza, 3 debates with Dinesh D'Souza, whom you may know. Dinesh had an interesting explanation for why there's suffering in the world. He pointed out that he had read scholarship that indicated that life had to began on Earth because of unique conditions involving the structure of planet Earth, in particular because of our tectonic plates. With the tectonic plates that shift under the Earth, provided conditions that made it possible for life to emerge on Earth. So if there hadn't been shifting tectonic plates, we wouldn't have life. And if we didn't have life, we wouldn't be here. But since we're here, and since there's shifting tectonic plates, there have to be suffering. I mean, tectonic plates cause earthquakes and things and volcanoes. And so, of course, there has to be suffering. Otherwise, there couldn't be life. God had to allow suffering because that's how he had to create life. He made this argument seriously, and I thought, this is the strangest argument I've ever heard. For one thing, he's admitting that we descended from earlier life forms. He's a conservative evangelical who believes not just that we descended from earlier forms of primate, but we descended from the earliest little one-celled things that were floating around in the sea of muck. That seems weird, and I don't think he realized that was a problem. But also, the bigger problem for me was, are you saying that the Almighty God couldn't create life without a tectonic plate? Because God's hands were tied on that one? Oh, God, life? Oh, geez, okay, it's got to be a tectonic plate. There's no other way to do it. Really? I mean, that makes tectonic plates more powerful than God. Okay. I had a radio debate with Richard Swinburne, who was a philosopher at Oxford, that basically drove me nuts. Swinburne wanted to argue why the Holocaust may have happened as a solution to why God would allow it to happen, which is when we recognize the horrors of the Holocaust, it makes us more noble as human beings. It contributes to our nobility, those of us who have survived. I get very angry at answers like that. I don't think that these 10,000 children who died over the last 24 hours had to starve to death in horrible misery and pain so that I could become more noble. What is wrong with people? I had a debate with Tom Wright, who's a very fine New Testament scholar, one of the top New Testament scholars in the world by, I think, anybody's calculation, who's also I don't know if he considers himself an evangelical, but I don't know if he does, a British evangelical, I guess, but very, very bright guy. And we had a debate. And his idea is that the entire Bible lays out the plan of God, and that if you understand the entire plan of God from beginning to end, from creation to apocalypse, and you see this, you see it's an entire plan, and that suffering is all part of the plan, and that we shouldn't wrestle with these issues of suffering unless we keep the whole big picture in mind. You're dealing with trees, and you should be thinking about the forest, kind of thing. And so that didn't go down well with me either. And I kept saying things. You mean, like, why is part of the plan that that 1,700 people have to die of malaria every day, despite our advances? Why does there have to be massive starvation? Why does a child have to starve to death every 5 seconds for God's plan to work? And I started, kind of giving out the statistics about suffering. And then Tom finally said, look, I don't know why Bart keeps throwing suffering in our face. That's what we're debating. You can ignore the things on the ground by talking about the grand plan of God, but I don't buy it, because there could have been a different plan. I had a debate a couple months ago with a Muslim apologist who wanted to say that, we can explain suffering. This was a podcast, an interview debate, an hour that I got really angry with and kind of went over the top. I tend to get angry at these. It's just about the only thing I get angry about. I don't really get angry about people arguing about the Bible, but this thing is suffering. I take it seriously because I just don't think pain and misery is something to explain away so that you feel good about yourself. This guy came up with the argument, look, children starve to death, but then when they die, they are going to be given an eternal reward. And so it's okay. So I thought to ask the guy, I said, okay, so are you saying that children who die, they're going to be given their eternal reward? I said, no, you're a faithful Muslim, right? Yes. So is this true for non-Muslim people, or is it just true for Muslims? Oh, it's only Muslims. The Muslims are the ones who are going to go to heaven. Well, what's going to happen to the other people who don't go to heaven? Well, they're going to roast in the fire of hell forever. So you're saying that of these 10,000 children who've died over the last day, something like, 9,800 of them are going to roast in hell forever. Well, yeah, I'm afraid that's just how it works. That's your answer to suffering? That's why they're suffering? All right. So anyway, the one bright spot is there are lots of really, really intelligent believers, monotheist believers, Jew, Muslim, Christian, who have very good sense and say, look, I don't know why they're suffering. I believe in God. I believe in God. I do. I just look around. I think there's a God, and I think he's good. I do think he's powerful. Why they're suffering, I'm sorry, I just don't know. I really respect that myself. I respect that. That's the view my Christian friends have, and the view that the smart Christian theologians, you can't explain it, and that's fine. There are lots of things I don't know either. My conclusions, the validity and value of faith. I do not argue that faith is invalid or without value at all. I don't think it makes sense. It doesn't make sense to me to believe that there's a God who's all powerful and all loving, who's active in the world. Is there some other kind of God? Don't know that either. Is there value of faith? I don't trash faith. I don't trash people who have faith. I tend to trash fundamentalists and apologists who say stupid things about suffering. Other than that, I don't, there is huge value to people having faith. There is. Of course, they find meaning in life. They find purpose in life. They have something to live for. They often it drives them to be good people. I'm all for good people. Whatever floats your boat and makes you a good person. Okay, as long as you're not hurting other people. Despite the fact that I left the faith over this issue, I continued to teach the Bible. And the irony, people ask me this all the time, but the irony is I don't teach anything differently from what I taught before. I still teach the kind of scholarship I taught before because I was a critical scholar as a Christian. I'm a critical scholar as a non-Christian, and I still love the Bible. I think the Bible's great. I think it's wrong in a lot of things, and I think it'd be used in very, very, very harmful ways. But, I spend my life studying this thing. In the end, I consider myself a Christian atheist. I'm an atheist. I talk about agnosticism and atheism in the next lecture and how I define those. I don't believe in God. I do believe in the Christian values as I read them from the teachings of Jesus. I think the idea that you should give of yourself for others, you should love your neighbor as yourself, you should do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. I believe those principles. And so I follow the teachings of Jesus as I understand them, not all of the teachings, but I'm still an atheist. So an atheist who tries to follow the best moral teachings of Jesus. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'll pick up there in my next lecture with changing your views. And I want to deal with some of those here from my experience and knowing about the experiences of others. And so I'm calling this the traumas of deconversion, emotional, social, and eschatological, which is a fancy way of saying people are, fear what's going to happen in the afterlife. Okay, so let me advance my slide. There we go. Okay. So disincentives to deconverting. To get to some of the disincentives I had when I left the faith, I have to explain what incentives I had to join the faith. As I said, I was always connected with Christianity and active in the church. But when I became born again as a 15-year-old, there were things that were incentives, or at least maybe not incentives for me to convert, but there were things that once I did convert, I thought were benefits to having become a committed born-again Christian. One was very important to me as somebody who lived the life of the mind already as a teenager and was interested in kind of questions of truth and meaning. I became convinced that my form of committed Christianity was true and conveyed the truth. And for me, that was very important, that I wanted to know the truth, and Jesus was the truth. And other views that didn't include Christ as the Lord of the world were simply wrong. And I wanted to know the truth, and I thought I had found it already. Believing in God, I understood God to be the ultimate good, and I chose the good. I knew there was a lot of evil in the world, and I wanted to be on the side of the good. And as somebody who became a committed follower of Christ, I believe then I was on the side of the ultimate good. I found meaning in life. The world is much bigger than, just our physical presence on it. Even though we live in a vast universe, you can find meaning if you're connected with the God who created it all, in my view at the time. It provided purpose for life. One purpose was my recognition that now I had salvation, that I was right with God and with the creator of all things, the Lord Almighty, and that being right with him meant having a brilliant afterlife, and that other people too could share that. And so one of my purposes in life was in order to help others also find this great gift that I had been given. I definitely believed in the afterlife, and knew now that I was going to go to heaven, and was not at all afraid of dying. I remember my Episcopal priest I still went to the Episcopal Church after having this born again experience until I finished high school. And the rector was a fantastic man, really kind and gentle and interesting and insightful and wise and smart. He went to Harvard as an undergraduate and was majored in philosophy. He was a smart guy. But he, at one point when he knew that I really became even more committed to the faith, he gave me a crucifix, with Jesus hanging on it. And I put it around my neck, of course, and I slept with it. And my dad was a little worried about, sleeping with something like that around your neck. What if you choke? And my response was, well, even better. I'll die then. And so eventually, by the way, years later, when I deconverted, I kept the chain, but I took off the crucifix, and I still continue to wear a chain around my neck it's kind of a symbolic thing for me. Okay, afterlife. So I had, oh boy, yeah, I was going to heaven. Oh boy, baby. uh, Also, this relates to some of the other things, but I felt like I had a kind of certitude that people didn't have otherwise. People were confused about life and the meaning of it all and what we're doing here. And man, I had the answers. Uh, as I studied the Bible more and more, I got more and more of the answers. And man, was I one certain fellow. I probably was rather unpleasant to be around. I had more answers than questions, but I had certitude. And as somebody who was now one of the chosen ones, I had insider status. Uh, that's kind of egotistical of me, but I think I looked at it that way. I'd never put it that way. I never. But it was kind of a one-upmanship. The rest of the world may be going to hell in a handbasket, but man, I'm in there. I'm on the inside. I think these are things that a lot of converts to evangelical Christianity have, and even people who grow up evangelical Christian, and that these are things that were incentives or for me to convert, or at least were things that were benefits of my conversion. Well, when I wanted to deacon, my biggest fears of leaving the faith, one thing is I was going to lose all that. Important to me, to my inner well-being, to my thought processes, to my life, to where I wanted to go in life, to what I wanted to do in life, to what I thought the meaning of life was, to ultimate reality. I had certitude about ultimate reality. Now I was going to give that up. That's big. I thought that if I left the faith, I was afraid that there'd be very serious social disruption. My family, as I said, I'd grown up religious. My family was fairly religious, but when I became born again, I discussed all that at length with my family, and they also became more highly religious. My parents became conservative evangelicals. My sister became a conservative evangelical. My brother never, I'm not sure if he ever identified as a conservative evangelical, but he was a very serious church person. And my parents were to the day of their death. My brother and sister still are committed Christians. And I knew that this would create a rift, in part because I was partly responsible for their kind of turning up the religious fervor. But also my friends were Christian. I got into college with Christian friends. My friends, when I go back home, were Christian. My connections were all Christian. How are you supposed to kind of move on from that if your friends and your family and most of your associates, and weekly church services where you weren't particularly friendly with these people in the sense that you're going to hang out with them, but they're, you get together, you say prayers together, you share each other's burdens, you help each other out, and I'm going to leave all of that. That was really troubling for me. One thing that was really big for me, a lot of people have thought that, some people leave the faith because then, it kind of frees them up and they feel kind of exalted because they're not under any more restrictions anymore ethically. And I had the opposite thought going into it. I actually was a little bit afraid of leaving the faith because I thought I would no longer have any moral compass. There'd be nothing to kind of guide my actions because as a Christian, I thought that the Bible gave me direction. God gave me direction. I knew how to behave. I knew how to do what was right. I knew what was right. And my sense was if I didn't have God in my life anymore, I'd have no direction in life. And morally, that was repugnant to me because I was afraid of what I might do. I was thinking, oh my God, I leave the faith. I mean, it's like, what's going to stop me from just being like a wild man? I mean, it's like, it's going to be an orgy every night. And after I deconverted, I realized that was completely wrong. It didn't have to be an orgy every night. I'm just once a week is perfectly fine. No, I'm kidding. That may get edited out. What ends up happening is, in my case, now I cannot speak for everyone. The people I know have had a similar experience, though, which is that leaving the faith had no significant difference at all on my my ethical life, my moral direction, and that in many ways, I would say I'm more moral now than I was then, more ethical now than I was then. But that's a discussion I'll be holding a little bit further in my next lecture. And so I'm not going to go into it now, but I'll just say it's nonsense that without God, there's no reason to be ethical. There's no reason to love your neighbor. You have no reason to love your neighbor. You have no reason to be completely self-centered now. You're going to just be self-centered because there's nothing else in the world, right? So you can just be, and no, it doesn't work that way. At least it doesn't for me. I was especially afraid of the afterlife. When I was a committed Christian, I knew I was going to go to heaven, but then I was thinking about leaving the faith, and I was terrified. What if I was wrong? What if I leave the faith and I would have been right in the first place? What's going to happen to me? I want to talk about that fear in particular because it's a fear that many people have, and I want to discuss the way that I dealt with it because it was a difficult thing for me. People who aren't Christian, who aren't religious, or they have trouble kind of getting their minds around this one. Like, really? You're afraid of going to hell? What's wrong? But no, actually, if it's drummed into you, when I was a young child, before I became a committed Christian, we were absolutely were taught about heaven and hell, and we believed it, and it was in my bones. And so if you leave the faith, it's a serious concern. So I want to talk about fears of dying, death, and afterlife. Or I'm sorry, dying, death, and after death. I'm not completely comfortable with the term afterlife because after life comes death. The question isn't about what comes after life. What comes after life is death. The question is what comes after death. That's the issue. And so dying, death, and after death. So I know many people who are not afraid of being dead or becoming dead. They're afraid of dying. And not because of the uncertainties of it, but because of the burden that it creates and the suffering that it can cause. So the suffering for the person herself, that what she might experience and how horrible that can be, but also the burden on family, financial burdens and time burdens, and some people are really afraid of the dying process. And I have to admit that has never been a big concern of mine. I don't know why, but for some people that's the overarching issue. And for me, it was less that. It really was about death and what happens afterwards. In particular, I was afraid that if I blew it and gave it all up, that if I had been right, that God would punish me and I would go to hell. That was a very big fear. And so I had to work through it. I had to work through it both rationally and emotionally. In some ways, it was easier to work through it rationally for me. And luckily for me, going back to when I was a kid, I tend to be a rational person who tries to allow his emotions to follow his reason, and so I'm one of these really irritating people who points out why fears are irrational, which is crazy because of course most fears aren't rational, and you can't get out of them by becoming rational now. If you're afraid of flying, somebody telling you that you're more likely to die on the route to the airport, it just doesn't help. So I get that. But in my case, rationality helps me deal with my emotional state. My Christian sense was that God, that after death, people would die, their bodies would decompose, and their souls would go to heaven and hell. And if you were not on God's side through Christ, you would go to hell. I firmly believed that, which was one reason that I became evangelistic, trying to convert other people for fear that my friends, my family, they wouldn't go to heaven. And I wanted people to enjoy salvation. And so that was my firmly rooted sense that I had for, my, most of my life up until this. But when I was leaving the faith, and then later when I left the faith, I had certain realizations that helped me think it through in a different way. For one thing, I decided actually to study what the Bible says about heaven and hell. this is one of my recent books where I talk about this. If this is an issue that you're interested in, I have a book called Heaven and Hell, where I talk about where the ideas of heaven and hell come from, because I came to realize they don't come from the Bible. Our view that you die and your soul then goes to one place or the other is not a biblical view. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, the general sense is that when you die, that's the end of your story. You're alive so long as your spirit or your breath is within you, but your breath is not, or your spirit is not an entity that exists outside of you. And so Greeks and Romans had a different view of this, but at least many did. But Jews thought that the human being was a singular entity. It was a material being that was enlivened by a spirit, but the spirit wasn't an independent thing. So you think about the Adam and Eve story. God creates Adam before he creates Eve. He creates Adam, and he makes this clay, this dirt figure on the ground. It's just a humanoid statue, and he's just lying there. It's a lump of dirt. God breathes into it and makes it a living creature. Life is when you've got your breath inside of you. What happens when you stop breathing? You're no longer alive. But even we think, when you stop breathing, when you die and you stop breathing, where does your breath go? Breath doesn't go anywhere. That's what they thought the spirit was. The spirit is the thing that enlivens you. And so when you die and you that's it. For the Old Testament, death is the end of the story. And by the way, when you get to the New Testament, the teaching again is not that your soul goes to heaven or hell. This is not what Jesus taught. It's not what Jesus taught. I try to demonstrate this in my book. And you might think, oh yeah, what about this verse? What about that passage? But I'm telling you, I deal with all these passages in my book to try and show this was not the belief of Jesus and his early followers at all. They thought there would be an afterlife, but it would be a bodily afterlife. People would be raised in their bodies at the end of time. God created the human as a unitary phenomenon. It was a unit. It was one thing, and a material that was enlivened by breath. And at the end, the bodies are going to come back. God will breathe life back into bodies. There will be a resurrection of the dead. For these Jews, the Jewish apocalypticists like Paul and Jesus and his followers, the end is going to come when bodies return to life at the resurrection of the dead. Jesus was resurrected. His body came back to life, and his followers will be resurrected. Those who do not follow Jesus in the New Testament view are not going to be sent off to hell. There's no hell. They're going to be annihilated. They're going to be wiped out of existence forever. So the Bible doesn't even teach heaven and hell. And so that helped me think, well, maybe, and I realized that where it came from Greek philosophy of all places. But I try to show that in my book, that it's not a biblical teaching. Over time, I also started to question the existence of what we might call the soul. Of course, I don't think the soul goes to heaven or hell, but that's not what the biblical authors thought. But, it sure seems like we have a soul. It feels like it, so what's that all about? At one point, while I was doubting my faith, I really got interested in the instance of Phineas Gage. You all know about him, this 19th century figure. He was not a biblical scholar. He was a railroad worker who he's the guy who had this crazy accident where he was tamping an explosion into a rock wall for making a railway. And he looked away for a second and the thing ignited, and the iron tamper that he was using was blown out of the hole and went up through his jaw area, up through his eye and out through his brain, and landed 80 feet away. And this metal thing, an inch and a half wide, went through his brain, and he lived. And he was still talking afterwards. And it damaged his brain, damaged the frontal lobe rather seriously, but he lived on and his personality changed. because, well, you're missing part of your brain. Your personality changes, and this is, it's in all the neuroscience books and all the psychology books and stuff. I started thinking, I finally realized, what I think of as my soul is kind of like my personality, and it's all tied to my brain, baby. It is neurons in there. I got 100 billion neurons or 80 billion neurons, and they each have like about 10,000 connections. I got 1 trillion synapses, and that's where my being comes from. It's where my thoughts come from, my memories come from, my personality comes from, my desires, my intellect, my thinking, everything comes from that. I started thinking that our soul, somehow it doesn't exist apart from my brain. My mind does not exist apart from my brain. This, of course, is a very long conversation, and every one of you probably has an opinion about it. Some of you are really knowledgeable about it. I came to question the existence of the soul, starting with Phineas Gage. And then I did a lot of reading on it too. I started thinking that there was no soul that was going to live after death, which happens to be the view of the Old Testament. I started being rational about the whole thing and thinking, look, the Bible doesn't teach this. I think that probably I don't understand how I can have a soul. How I can have a personality and things if I'm really a creature of matter. But then I started thinking, the Christian idea that there's a hell, which is picked up by Islam, and there are other religions that have a hell. The Christian idea is that if you don't believe in Jesus, or if you aren't on God's side, or if you're a bad person, he's going to punish you. But this punishment in Christian tradition is an eternal punishment. If somebody is, say, 30 years old, and they've been kind of cognizant about life and like how to behave for 20 years, they die. And suppose they haven't been the best person in the world, don't believe in Jesus, and and they've maybe done some wrong things. And according to the traditional Christian tradition, they're going to be tormented forever. They weren't well behaved for 20 years, and they're going to be tormented for 20 trillion years, and that won't even be the beginning. What kind of monster is God to torture people, or to allow people to be tortured for trillions and trillions of years, nonstop, never ending, in exchange for a few years of bad behavior? Really? I came to a point where I just didn't believe it anymore. I thought, even before I deconverted, even though emotionally I was kind of tied to the idea of hell, rationally I'm thinking there's just no way. Because if there is a God, this was my opinion at the time, if there is a God, he's a God of love. And it's not going to be 20 trillion years for 20 years, let alone 20 trillion years not even being the beginning of it. So I don't think God is worse than the worst Nazi criminal who ever tortured people, that he's 1 trillion times worse than that. I just don't believe it. Just didn't believe it. When I deconverted, then I tried to use these thoughts that I'd started having before my deconversion to calm myself down. I really don't believe that I'm going to be punished. And the reason I deconverted was not because I wanted to be a wicked person or I wanted to deny the truth. I was trying to do my earnest best to understand the world and my place in it. And I believed as a Christian that God had given me a brain. And I didn't think he gave me a brain so I wouldn't use it. And I didn't think that what I'd learned as a 10-year-old or a 14-year-old or as a 17-year-old at Moody was necessarily the ultimate truth. I was a kid. I'm using my brain. I'm trying to understand it. This seems more reasonable to me. I just don't believe God's going to punish me for that. But there's another fear of death that many people have and that I had, the terrors of non-existence. Some people, for some people, this just really, really, really gets to them. The idea that we exist now and we're conscious now, but there will come a time when we don't exist. That is terrifying to people. Just the void, as I used to call it, as many people still call it today, the void, where you die and you no longer exist. How can you get your mind around non-existence? And it's terrifying to people. That was my human sense. I don't know if after converting, but right around that time, it terrified me, trying to imagine non-existence. Of course, it's in some sense, it's impossible to imagine non-existence, because since we've had imagination, we've imagined existing. Since we've been alive, since we've been able to think, we've known of ourselves as living beings. So we don't have any experience of thinking of ourselves as non-living beings. And so it's hard to do, but it's also, it can be horrifying to people. But in the end, I ended up not worrying about that either. And it's not something I worry about now at all. This is one of my rationalistic triumphs. Some people, I guess, can pull this one off and maybe others can't, but this was a triumph of reason for me. I decided it'd be a good time to be rational when thinking about non-existence. And I realized that this has been an issue as I actually started thinking about it and studying it a little bit. I began to realize that it was an issue way back in antiquity. People who didn't believe in an afterlife thought about non-existence. And they had solutions that people today still use that I find rather gratifying and actually reasonable. It makes so much sense to me that it's calmed down my emotions almost completely. Even Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher, who happened, by the way, to be the emperor of Rome at the end of the 2nd century, he dealt with this. And his view was that he was not disturbed by non-existence before he was born. So why would he be disturbed by non-existence after he's dead? What's to worry about? Are you upset that you weren't alive 300 years ago? No, does it really bother you? Does it like really creep you out that you weren't alive then? Well, then why would it creep you out? You're not going to be alive 300 years from now. Or one way to put it is, how upset were you when the Civil War was taking place? You weren't a cognizant being. You weren't a being. You weren't alive. You didn't exist. So you weren't upset by it. You're not going to be upset about what happens after you're gone either. What happens to your body? What happens to your family? What happens to your country? What happens to your world? I don't think I reasoned with myself, look, you don't need to be upset about non-existence, and you don't need to be terrified with it, because if our universe came into being 13.8 billion years ago, as I think it did, or they change the dates a little bit sometimes, but 13.8 billion years ago, say there was a big bang, that means for about 13.8 billion years, I didn't exist. So it'll go on like that. So I'm far less worried about non-existence than I used to be. That may not help anybody, but it's the way I went. After I deconverted, I had to think about what had happened, both before, with my conversion and then with my deconversion, and had to think through it. And, I'm a retrospective guy, and so I did think about it. I've had a number of people explain my deconversion to me, which is always very interesting to have somebody else explain your personal psychic processes, especially people who have never known you before, people who've never even talked with you once, explaining why you did something. Okay. But, there are a lot of people who get upset, especially if they are committed members of a social group or a political group or a religious group, who get very upset when somebody leaves it. They feel abandoned. And when it comes to some of these issues, they feel like the person's gone over to the dark side, and that they don't realize how harmful what they've done is going to be to themselves. And so that makes sense to me. But it is a little bit funny that people try and explain at least to me. I've had a number of people assure me that I was not ever really born again, that I never asked Jesus into my heart, that I never accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior, that I was never committed, that I was never an evangelical. Why? Because they have a theology that says, the way we used to put it when I was evangelical, once saved, always saved. The idea is that a person who has salvation cannot be unsaved. But if I'm denying that God exists, then obviously I can't be saved. If I'm not saved, it must mean I wasn't saved. And so I wasn't sincere. I do get that a lot. About a month ago, somebody told me that they thought I was still saved. They're an evangelical Christian. They're convinced I was going to go to heaven with the evangelicals because once saved, always saved. I said, wow, okay then. That's an interesting view. What can you say? I mean, was I sincere about my faith. There aren't too many human beings on the planet who are more sincere about their faith than I was. I may not have been. I mean, there are some real fanatics out there, but in terms of sincerity, there was no insincerity there. I can just tell you. Many people have told me that the problem is that I was too intellectual in my faith. Sometimes that line is that you just studied too much. You just got to learn you can't learn that much. You just tried to know too much, and that ruined you. And a lot of people think that I intellectualized my Christianity and that I never had any kind of personal spiritual existence. These people think that I spent my time kind of reasoning the faith as an apologist or as a scholar, and that it was all up in my head, but I never had a relationship with God through Christ. And all I can say to that is that too is completely wrong. When I was born again, it was not about, not being errors in the Bible, about an inerrant Bible, or about defending the historicity of the resurrection, or about whatever. It wasn't a propositional thing in my head that was just intellectual. It just wasn't that. It was a spiritual experience I had where I actually, wanted to be right with God and thought that Christ, as the Son of God, could be my savior and companion through life. And so it was not that I was just kind of this intellectual nerd into Christianity. The most common explanation I get from people, I get this all the time, and almost always from people who didn't know me, is that the problem was that I was a fundamentalist. And what they say to me is that if you had not been raised a fundamentalist, then when you started having doubts, you wouldn't have left the faith. Usually this is said to me by Christians who are mainline Christians, Christians who don't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, who think that since my faith was rooted in a fundamentalist understanding of the Bible, once I saw problems with the Bible, I had to deconvert. That's the logic they use. I understand the logic, and it's completely wrong. Again, they don't know anything about me. I didn't start out as a fundamentalist. My first 15 years of my life were as a non-fundamentalist Christian. I was a fundamentalist, I suppose, for maybe 9 years. I should probably do the math sometime. That must have been more than that. 1940, I don't know. But I was probably a fundamentalist for about 9 years. When I left fundamentalism, so what would that be? About 8 or 9 years. When I left it, I didn't deconvert. I became a mainline Christian, believing the sorts of things these people believe. I didn't leave the faith because of my fundamentalist assumptions. I left the faith because I just couldn't believe that there's any kind of God in the world who's active. And so these are all easy explanations for people who want to explain it, maybe to themselves. Or to others, if you weren't a fundamentalist, or if you weren't, So, but still, as a human being, I do need to explain my own religious experiences. Sometimes I do get asked more genuinely, what do you make of, what had happened to you? How do you explain your conversion, for example? Because now but what do you think happened? And so I just tell them, that I think that there are emotional and psychological reasons for people to commit to particular religious traditions. It's not just within Christianity. People do this with Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism. They decide that they want to join this faith community and this tradition, and there's some kind of emotional drive. In my case, I was kind of inherently religious anyway. This seemed to be kind of a step up with the religion I had been on before, and it gave me truth and meaning and purpose. And so it made perfect sense for me to convert. But you don't need to say that God touched my heart, that there was a supernatural intervention for me to convert. And it isn't, again, I mean, when I converted, it was a spiritual blast. I mean, it was like, ooh, boy, it's energetic. And that's what happens when people convert. A lot of energy gets released. People ask me, well, how do you explain answers to prayer? Because you used to pray and you probably got answers to prayer. So how did that work? My view is, of course, the prayer doesn't get answered. People say, yeah, but I prayed for this thing and it happened. So when I was an evangelical, when I started out, when I was in high school and was converted, I was convinced that the Bible was right, that if you ask anything in Jesus' name, you'll get it. When I lost a particularly important debate tournament one time, I realized that wasn't true because I'd asked Jesus in his name and I didn't win it. So then, it didn't take long for me to realize, probably the other team was praying to Jesus too. And eventually, that one of you got to lose. And so praying to Jesus ain't going to work every time. And then when I got a little bit more mature and at Moody, we said, sometimes, you ask God and sometimes God says no. That's his answer. No. But, that's a convenient thing. That means that prayer doesn't, what difference does it make then? And I started thinking, what difference does it make if you pray at all? Isn't God going to do what's best? Are you going to like twist his arm, kind of convince him? Like you've got better reasons than he knows about, or that he doesn't know you need this. And so I don't think prayer is answered. I think Christians have ways of explaining why they're not answered, but I don't think they're answered any more than hopeful thoughts. So that, today when I have a sick friend or somebody's having a difficulty of some kind, when I send them a note, I won't say, I'm praying for you. I'll just say, I'm sending you many happy thoughts. And so far as I can tell, it's been equally successful. About a year after I converted and became born again, I got involved with a charismatic group where we believed in the gifts of the Spirit, as described by Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians, one of which is the ability to speak in tongues, where a person will begin speaking some unknown language. In the New Testament, in the book of Acts, the speaking in tongues refers to speaking in known foreign languages. When Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians, it appears to be unknown languages, languages of angels. They're not human languages. Today, when people speak in tongues, it's normally that. It is a unknown language. Tongues, most people don't realize, is a intercultural phenomenon. There are other religious traditions that have this phenomenon known as glossolalia. Glossolalia means speaking in tongues. And I myself received the gift of the Spirit so that I could speak in tongues. And I spoke in tongues when I was a late teenager, speaking in some unknown language that I didn't even know what it was. I could pray in that language and I could do it out loud. And I considered that to be a gift of the Spirit. Today, people say, well, okay, doesn't that show that, the Spirit of God was upon you? And I say, no, I can do the same thing now. And I absolutely can. Promicatio tule. I can just go like that for a long time. So I think it's a psychological condition that people get geared up for it. They get explained how it happens. They start doing it, and it's an amazing thing, and you feel uplifted, but I don't think that there's anything non-physical about it. I think it's just an emotional state that you can get yourself into. What about miracles? Well, what about all those miracles that happen? How do you explain them? I don't think they happen. I don't believe miracles happen. I mean, crazy things happen, but I don't think they are divine interventions from outside. All sorts of crazy things happen. And it isn't just Christians that they happen to. I know as many people who have had remissions of cancer so that it just disappears, who are non-Christian as a Christian and who don't pray about it. It's just a weird thing that happens sometimes. When I was a Christian, we believed miracles because we heard them. And man, we believed just about every miracle we heard. We just believed it, whatever. When I would see miracles, every now and then, like a few times I saw something that we interpreted as a miracle. But as time went on, we realized, yeah, actually, Nothing happened. I saw people being healed of their nearsightedness, for example, or people having their demons cast out of them. And no, it didn't happen. So I don't believe in miracles. I do believe crazy things happen, wild things happen, interesting things happen, and they happen to both believer and non-believers. Questions leading to my unbelief. I came to question as a Christian. So this is when I'm thinking about deconverting. Here are some of the questions that led to my unbelief that were kind of countering my fears. So I began thinking, do I want to believe out of fear? Is belief really the sort of thing you do because you're forced to? You're afraid you're going to be punished? Is that what being faithful to God is? Being afraid of being punished? Is that what loving God is? You love God because if you don't, he's going to really make your eternity unbelievably miserable? Is that really love? Am I loving my neighbor as myself because I'm afraid God's going to punish me otherwise? Then what is believing out of fear all about? If I'm believing out of fear, that's crazy, I came to think. What about believing out of inertia? That's what a lot of people do. They were raised this way. They still think this. They've always thought this. So why think something else? That's fine. If I guess, if you don't want to be a thoughtful, reflective human being, but you want to be just kind of an emotive being that just goes with the flow and doesn't really think deep thoughts, that's fine. Just believe what you always believed. But for me, what I always believed wasn't necessarily correct. And so I wanted to know what really was true. What about Pascal's wager? I get asked this one a lot. Pascal, as you know, was a French philosopher in the Enlightenment, who was one of the most brilliant human beings during the Enlightenment and ever. Pascal, at one point, develops a view that has come down to be known as Pascal's wager. And it has to do with kind of a cost-benefit analysis, in a sense. It has to do with figuring out what is the most strategic way to approach faith. Suppose you decide to believe in God and you're wrong. Well, when you die, you're just wrong and you're dead now, so it doesn't matter. So there's no downside to believing in God in terms of your eternal well-being. What if you decide not to believe in God and you're wrong? Whoa, that's bad. So should you believe or not believe? The wager is that if you believe in God, you can't lose. But if you do believe in God, if you don't believe in God, you can lose. So if you're wagering whether God exists or not, you're better off believing he does because you can't lose. That's the wager. Okay, well, that makes sense. So you should believe because you know what harm's it going to do. It might help, can't harm. First of all, is that really belief? Really? Second of all, the very, very big problem with this is that Pascal's wager assumes that it's an either or, that there are two options, atheism or Christianity. What if there are many, many options? What Pascal did not take into account is that if the Muslims are right, you Christians are damned. So believing in the Christian God is not a fail-safe. So it's a crazy wager. So that's not convincing to me. What about the importance of truth? Is truth important or not? You may know that within intellectual circles in the West, issues about truth have been very problematic for the last 30 years or more, because for all sorts of reasons involving kind of theoretical discourses that I'm not going to get into. So I'm not going to be talking at a deep theoretical level now about whether there's such a thing as truth or whether it's accessible or anything like that in kind of the deep level. All I'm saying is, if you believe something, should it be reasonable or not? And if it's unreasonable, should you believe it? If it's unreasonable, it's probably not true. Do you want to believe things that are true or not? I came to think that truth was important, and in part because I became convinced that if something was true and there was a God, then the truth is on the side of God. So God's not the God of falsehood. So you can't believe something that's false and expect to be on God's side. So if you believe the Bible's inerrant and it's not, you're believing a falsehood. I came to think that all truth is God's truth. This is a saying sometimes attributed to St. Augustine, and that you don't have to fear pursuing the truth. You don't have to fear pursuing the truth, because the truth will not mislead you, and you will not be punished for believing the truth. My ultimate question leading to unbelief, maybe it would be better. I would certainly feel more comfortable about believing what I thought was reasonable. Maybe non-belief is better. I came to think that, and I ended up thinking I was right. For me, it's been better. Maybe not better for everyone. I don't know. Maybe it wouldn't be better for you. It's better for me. I'll be talking more about that in my next lecture. Okay. Look, here we go. Lecture 4, Is There Life After Faith? Happiness, Purpose, and a Meaningful Existence. I want to begin with talking about the terms agnosticism and atheism. I've been using the term principally atheist and atheism, but I want to talk about the relationship of the terms as I understand them. My understanding of the terms is different from what most people understand by the terms. Most people think what I actually thought when I was considering becoming a non-believer. I just assumed, like almost everybody does, that agnosticism and atheism are 2 degrees of the same thing. That's what most people think. In this view, agnosticism is an agnostic is somebody who says, I don't know if there's a God. And an atheist is somebody who says there is no God. And so there are 2 degrees of disbelief. One that is stating ignorance and the other is coming out and saying it. This is a view that is shared by most agnostics and atheists. And those who share these views, I found out once I deconverted, are rather militaristic about their positions, whether they are agnostic or atheist. So basically, with that schema, that there are 2 degrees of disbelief, atheists maintain that agnostics are simply wimpy atheists. they're atheists who just can't bring themselves to say there is no God, and they're just trying to back out of it, or they're just trying to to make sure they don't get in trouble in the afterlife by saying there's no God. They're trying to hedge their bets, and they're just being wimpy about it instead of just coming out and saying what they really think. So that's the atheist negative view of agnostics, which I had no idea. I just thought they're basically, got along. No, I mean, some do, obviously. So agnostics, by this way of thinking things, on the other hand, think that atheists are simply arrogant agnostics. Atheists don't know there's no God. Why do they say there's no God? You don't know. How would you know? You're just being arrogant about it. And so atheists think of agnostics as wimpy atheists, and agnostics think of atheists as arrogant agnostics. And so I get that. And I used to think that there are 2 degrees of things. And I thought, okay, I'm going to become an agnostic. I just don't know. And I identified that way for a long time. Now, though, I believe that agnosticism and atheism are not 2 different degrees of something. I think they're 2 different things. And that you can be both at once. And that I am, in fact, both at once. I'm both an agnostic and an atheist. By that, I mean that an agnostic is somebody who doesn't know. It comes from 2 Greek words, not knowing. So an agnostic, somebody who's agnostic is taking a position on epistemology, how you know what you know. If somebody were to ask me, do you know if there's a divine being in the universe? Do you have some kind of confident thought about that? No, I don't know. How would I know? I'm just I'm a peon like everyone else. I have no way of knowing that there's a divine being in the universe. But if they ask me, do you believe there is? I say, no, I don't believe there is. An atheist is talking about what they believe. An agnostic is talking about what they know. And so I think probably most agnostics really are. I think some agnostics would not say, I don't believe so. They would really say, I don't. But most atheists would agree, yeah, I don't really know. But not all. So anyway, there are different ways of understanding these terms. I'm just explaining this to say this is my understanding of the terms and the way I use the terms. That agnosticism is about what I know and atheism is about what I believe. With that said, I need to explode another widespread myth that is found among both Christians and agnostics and atheists, that when you are deciding whether you are going to be a Christian or, say, an atheist, that it's a decision you're making about whether to believe or not, whether you're going to believe anything or not. And that actually isn't the best way to put it, because everybody believes something. It's not a question of whether you believe. It's a question of what you believe. And it's an important distinction, and probably most people realize that, but it's important to emphasize it. It's not a matter of belief. It's a matter of what you believe, because everybody believes something. When I left the Christian faith, it wasn't that I became a blank slate without believing anything. I mean, I still believe, for example, I believe in existence. I believe that this world exists. I think I exist. Can I prove that? Actually, no, I can't prove it. But I have pretty good reason for thinking it's true. I believe in the scientific method myself. I think that science can demonstrate things. I believe that history happened. I believe a million things. What do I believe instead of the Christian God? Well, I'm going to be talking about that in this lecture. But I certainly believe the world exists and that we exist, and that there are ways of being in the world that are better than other ways of being in the world. So I've transferred from one belief to another. I have not transferred from belief to non-belief. When I decided to leave Christianity, leaving it for what? This is another way of asking basically the same question. When you leave one place, you go to another place. You never go to no place. You go somewhere. When I was deconverting, I naturally thought about other options. For a while there, before I was really contemplating atheism or agnosticism, I was contemplating Judaism. That made sense to me. I thought that Jesus was a human, a Jewish prophet, and that he showed the way to live, but that he was thoroughly Jewish, and that why shouldn't I just become Jewish? That got nixed as soon as I became an atheist, because I didn't believe there was God, and so I could have become a Jew without believing in God. A lot of my Jewish friends don't believe. There's no point in converting to Judaism for me. I didn't think. What about some other religion? In terms of other religions, I just simply never had. Just personally, I simply never had any interest or desire to explore other religions in terms of possible places to land. I'm interested in other religions for historical reasons and cultural reasons. But the fact that I'm interested in something like, modern Islam doesn't mean that I want to become a Muslim, or that I'm interested in the Hare Krishna. It means I want to, I never felt any kind of impulse toward any other religion. And so, but there are lots of other options. You can decide not to believe in the Christian God, but to believe in some kind of amorphous divine spirit being in the universe. Or you could become a pantheist, believing that God is involved, is in everything. You could develop a kind of spirituality without religion. There are all sorts of options. What I left for, was basically a form of humanism. I don't believe that there is a spiritual realm that is outside of the natural realm. I just don't believe it. I believe this material world that started with the Big Bang is all there is. I don't believe there's anything that is not material existence in some sense. I don't know what to do about the void, but basically all of existence, I think, all of our existence, everything that we are cognizant of and everything that we can be cognizant of had a beginning 13.8 billion years ago at the Big Bang. So I left basically for science, even though I'm not a scientist. But I really believe that we ourselves are material, that when we die, that's the end of our story, and that the world is material, and it too will die. If it's not. I don't think you're going to fry in hell, but I think this world's going to fry when the sun blows up, and I think eventually the second law of thermodynamics is going to have its way, that it's intractable, that there's no way to stop it, and that eventually there won't even be matter left. It'll just, in trillions of years, will be scattered molecules. Moving into this worldview, I had to wrestle. I'm going to go back to this point now and develop it a little bit more with the issue of how to be moral and what morality would mean in a world like that. A world that is temporary and transient, as a human being who himself is very, very temporary and transient. The world, Earth, came into existence about 4.5 billion years ago. I came into existence about 67 years ago and counting. And I will cease to exist. The world will cease to exist. What does morality mean with somebody with that point of view? And is it possible to lead a good and happy life with that point of view? I've thought a good bit lately about morality and ethics. The book I'm working on now is a book on the ethics of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus about morality and ethics in relationship to the broader world at the time. And so I've been reading a lot of Roman and Greek moral philosophy. Philosophers were the ones who talked about how to behave and why to behave that way. And I've been reading a ton of that stuff. And I'll be putting Jesus in relationship to that, and Christianity and the distinctive Christian ethic in relationship to that. It's made me think a lot about theistic morality. If you have a God, if you believe in a God, how does that affect how you behave morally? And I'm going to have to do this very simply, obviously, because it's, I hope it's not too simplistic, but, why does somebody who's a theist behave morally? Well, many people, in my experience, at least within the Christian tradition, behave in ways that they understand to be moral because of fear of punishment. They need to be a good person because if they're a bad person, they'll be punished. That's not just within the Christian tradition. It's in many traditions, including some Greek and Roman traditions, that you're afraid that there might be some kind of afterlife and you might be punished. That, by the way, doesn't strike me as a very good reason to be moral. You love somebody because you're afraid not to? Why don't you just love them? So I don't know. That doesn't strike me as a very compelling thing. Divine deontology. Okay, well, I had to use one big word here. So deontology is a word that ethicists have long used, going back to Immanuel Kant, which luckily comes from two Greek words. One word for that is something like it is necessary, and logos is like the study of. So it's the study of or the understanding of what is necessary. There are people, Immanuel Kant is especially known for this, the philosopher, the Enlightenment philosopher, for saying that there are certain things that are inherently right and certain things that are inherently wrong, and we need to figure out what those are so that we can behave correctly. Because if you're human, you want to behave like a human. Being a human means behaving correctly. You need to act rightly. And so there are certain rules, and to find out the rules, you have to figure them out. And so ethicists try to figure out what's the right thing to do. And when you know the right thing to do, that's what you do. Christianity has a kind of view that I don't know if other people call it this. They probably do. I don't know. But I call it the divine deontology, where you know what to do because God tells you. How do you know how to be moral? God tells you. Read the Bible. It tells you the do's and don'ts. So do and don't. This too is a problematic understanding of morality, in large part because the laws that God gives in the Bible, many of them are ones that Christians choose not to follow because they don't think they apply to them. They apply only to Jews. But even laws that, should apply to, no reason for them not to apply to Christians. Many Christians don't follow the laws, at least the way they're described in the Old Testament. And, I would argue that many Christians don't follow the teachings of Jesus. In fact, I'm going to be arguing in my book, I'm going to be saying in my book, I actually don't know anybody. Personally, I don't know anybody who's literally followed the teachings of Jesus about how to live. That might seem weird, and people are going to contest that, but I think I could show it. But in any event, I don't think divine deontology works very well. A lot of Christian apologists claim that there is no reason to be good unless you have objective criteria that can guide you. You need to have objective criteria, otherwise you can't know how to live. There is certainly logic behind this, and they can come up with logical demonstrations of it, and I think it's completely wrong. I don't believe in such things as objective criteria for how to behave, because even people who believe in objective criteria believe in exceptions, and exceptions have to be made in light of circumstances. Some people will say they don't believe in exceptions, but they do, and they can be shown to believe in exceptions. Many people say it's wrong to lie, but they think, okay, that God says don't lie, so I don't lie. But there are instances where they think it's right to lie, or don't murder. Well, there are instances in which it's right to murder. And so some people more sophisticated will say, okay, so the basic criterion is don't lie, don't commit murder. But, it's more sophisticated than that, that in this situation, the objective criterion says you can. But the reality is that our personal experiences in our daily lives don't allow us to apply objective criteria at every point, because the objective criteria have not been formulated in light of all the situations that we face. Moreover, I don't think objective criteria, I think you can empirically show they don't work very well, because people with objective criteria don't all behave the same way. So what good does it do to have the objective criterion? In any event, these are some of the ways that theists behave, and the reasons they behave and how they behave. Is there any logic, though, of godless morality? In other words, if you don't have God, you're not fearing punishment, you don't think God's told you what to do, and you might have objective criteria. You could be a Kantian and develop ways that make sense to you of objective criteria, but most people don't. So what would godless criteria? Let me tell you what my view is. Why are we inclined to be moral, and how do we know what is moral? I think we are inclined to morality. Not absolute morality, but I think that the human race has survived for these low hundreds of thousands of years, precisely because we have evolved in ways that allow us to get along together sufficiently to survive. And that if we didn't have some basic forms of morality that could be manifest in numerous cultures, that the human race would not have survived. We survive because we have evolved in certain ways, and our DNA determines how we think and what we think is right. It's in our DNA at some basic level because of how we've evolved. People who were, so let me just say, I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but as you probably have noticed, there probably are evolutionary psychologists with us on this, and evolutionary biologists, and I will bow to your authority. In my understanding of things and my judgment of things, without certain kinds of social functions evolving, the human race would not have evolved. And the selection process, the natural selection process, has favored certain kinds of social behaviors. These social behaviors are found at the genetic, they occur at the base, at the genetic level. And so we're born that way. Why do you love your children more than your strangers? You think, well, that's just obvious, because you do. Well, why is that, though? It's a survival mechanism. Your genes survive if you do that. If your children survive, your genes will survive. It's not that your genes are sitting around thinking, well, how am I going to survive here? It's that people who take care of their children tend to have their genes supplied for future generations. People who are concerned more from some person they never know, their genes die out. What it means to be human to me means to be an evolved creature. I know a lot of Christians have difficulty with the very idea of evolution. I find it remarkable that university students sometimes have problems with it. I was with a bunch of students one time, having a Coke or something and talking about stuff at some restaurant. And there are about 10 students there. This is a Chapel Hill, a really good school with smart students. And these students were sitting around the table talking about, the meaning of life or something. And they came to realize that I believe in evolution. Yeah, duh. I teach in a university. But these students are saying, oh, really? You believe that we descended from earlier forms of primate? And like they were surprised by this. And I said, well, where did you go to school? Have you had any science classes? Do you ever take biology, for example? And they were just surprised that I thought that. And I said, look, the problem is not that I think that we descended from lower forms of primate. I believe we descended from mud. That's a problem. So anyway, I think that we have morality built into us, and being human involves living the way we're structured. Some people are not designed to be very moral, and these people do propagate as well. But the way I'm wired is to care about others as well as myself. And hopefully some of you are.
Bart, are you there? I've lost your sound.
No, I'm sorry. I just unmuted myself. I don't believe that we care for others because of a divine being in the world. I believe we are caring for each other because that's how we are made as human beings. My personal experience as a moral agent is that I feel for other people. And I don't feel that I need to have a logical explanation for it. Apologists who tell me I have no reason to feel for others if there's no God, I think they're just talking nonsense and they know nothing about it. It's like saying I can't like other people. I can't like to help other people. For me, it's like saying I can't like chocolate ice cream. Why can't I? I just do like chocolate ice cream. And I'm not a big fan of fried liver. It's not because there's a logical reason for it. It's the way I'm built. And I'm built to, in part at least, love others. And so it isn't a matter of logic for me. There is a big question about self-centeredness. Isn't being agnostic a road to complete self-centeredness? In my experience, agnostics and atheists are no more self-centered than Christians or Jews or Muslims or anyone else. I think people tend to be self-centered. I've thought a lot about self-centeredness over the last couple of years, largely because I'm pretty self-centered. It's one of my unpleasant sides. I'm pretty self-centered. And I've been trying to think a lot about why I'm self-centered. My view of it is that most people on one level or another are self-centered. Some far more than others. I know some people who are really not that self-centered, but many people are self-centered. And I think part of the deal is that we, especially we who are agnostics and atheists, know that this world, this universe had a beginning, and the universe may not end, but I mean, every material object in the universe is going to end, and we are going to end. And, we live in a big universe. There are, we're just a peon just on this planet. On this planet, each of us is just an infinitesimal dot. Well, this planet is just a tiny little dot within the solar system. The solar system is just a tiny dot within the galaxy. There's something like 100 billion galaxy. There are 100 billion stars in our galaxy, and there are something like 100 billion or maybe 2 trillion galaxies, and God knows whether this is the only universe or whether it's a multiverse. I mean, you talk about being a peon, we are nothing, and we're only here for a little bit of just such a short period of time. We realize how insignificant we are. Why are we self-centered? I think many of us feel that if others recognize us as important, and we treat ourselves as particularly important, that it helps ease our uncomfort, our discomfort with being such insignificant creatures. Because at the end of the day, we are hugely insignificant, and we don't like that. And so we like to be the center of attention, or we like to have people praise us, or we like to have people think we're important, because if people think we're important, then we're important. And we're not just this little unimportant thing that's around for a little bit. That's my guess about self-centeredness. But I think it's true even of people who believe. I certainly know a lot of self-centered Christians. I want to point out that in ancient times, before there was Christianity, there was a lot of morality. I've been studying ancient wisdom, ancient philosophical discourse I've actually started studying Plato in graduate school. I read some Plato. I read some philosophy and stuff in college, but I got really interested in Plato, especially in graduate school, and in the Stoics, and in other philosophical schools. In the last few years, I've been just going, and I've taught it. I've actually taught some of that stuff at UNC. But I've been really reading a lot of it, and it made me think a lot about what it means to be a good person with a happy, fulfilling, purposeful life. Ancients thought about that, and they didn't think you needed the Christian God for it. And there's no reason that I can think of to think that they were lying or deceptive about it. They really believed it, and many of them were happy. In the ancient world, people tried to understand, going back at least to Aristotle and before him, why is it that we are different from other animals? And people, you probably have a way of explaining this. There are all sorts of explanations that are out there by scientists and by philosophers. In the ancient world, the basic answer was that unlike other living creatures, other animals, we are rational, and we're the only ones who have sophisticated reason. So we can use our reason, and it makes us different. Ancient philosophers tried to understand, well, then how can I be happy as a human being? How can I be satisfied as a human being? How can I feel content with my life? Well, it's by emphasizing the thing that makes you different from everything else. What makes you different is that you have rationality, you have reason. Some of the key players in this ancient wisdom would be people like Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, who were a major philosophical school at the time of Jesus and the New Testament, the Epicureans, another major philosophical school, the Cynics. I like all of these groups. I've been reading a lot about all of this stuff and reading their writings, and it's great. And it's helped me a lot understanding how I can lead a life that has meaning and purpose. I don't treat these things like the Bible. And the views these groups have are different from each other, but they're worth thinking about in a world without God, without the Christian God. All of these groups strove for the condition they call eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a term in ancient philosophy that is maybe usually translated into English as happiness. They were striving for happiness. I don't like that translation. Happiness for us is this momentary, fleeting thing where, oh God, I'm just really happy today. And tomorrow you're not. And eudaimonia is not that. It's not a fleeting emotion. It's more like a sense of well-being, a permanent sense that, I'm doing well and I'm happy with my life I'm happy with my life and I'm satisfied with my life. So it's like being self-satisfied, but not in a negative way, like really feeling content, like things are good. So eudaimonia is when things are good. So it involves being good and doing good and enjoying good. Eudaimonia, by the way, if you look at that, you can see the word demon. What? And the word eu in Greek means well or good. And so it means a good demon. A good demon. Yeah, demon in this context doesn't mean an evil spirit that makes, gets into little girls and makes their head spin around and have projectile vomiting. A daimon in ancient thinking was a spirit, a spiritual being, a divine being lower than the great gods. And if you have a good demon, it's like having a guardian angel. And so you've got a good life. You got a guardian angel's looking out after you. Only there's nobody else looking after you. You're doing it. You're being good. You're doing good, and you're enjoying good. If you do that, you have eudaimonia. Some philosophers thought you got that by virtue. Our word virtue has kind of negative connotations for a lot of people, that you're a goody-goody. The word virtue actually comes from the Latin word vir, V-I-R, or vir, which you get the word virulent from, for example, virile. Vir is the word for male adult, a man. Virtue is the way an adult man should live. Virtue is how an adult man should live, and that means virtue is what it really means to be human, on the understanding that that most people had that women were secondary human beings. But even some philosophers at the time thought that even women could have virtue, even though they were different virtues. And so the virtues, for example, philosophers would talk about the virtues of wisdom or prudence, where you kind of understand how you're supposed to live. Courage, where you're not afraid to do the right thing. Justice, where you are interested in other people being treated fairly. So wisdom, virtue, justice, courage, and self-control, where you just don't go nuts over things, but you control yourself. Because if you don't control yourself, you get into trouble and you get into excess. And it's never good to get into excess. It might seem like it is, but in the long run, it's very bad indeed. So virtue, some philosophers said you should strive for these kinds of virtues, and then you'll be a good person. And if you're good, it means you'll have a good life, which means you'll enjoy being good. Okay, so that was what some philosophers said. Some philosophers, especially the Epicureans, emphasize the importance of pleasure. How do we enjoy life? Well, we have pleasant experiences, so you should strive for pleasant experiences. These philosophers did not think that meant that you should go out and have wild parties all the time and get completely blasted out of your brain and do whatever you felt like to intensify your bodily pleasure. They actually insisted the opposite, that you should enjoy life by enjoying the simple pleasures. If you go to excess in pleasure, that's a very bad thing. Many philosophers insisted that one way to achieve eudaimonia is by self-sufficiency. These philosophers said, you get upset about things that are outside of your control. You shouldn't get upset about anything you can't control. In fact, you shouldn't worry about anything you can't control. You actually can't control whether you retain your job or not. So you shouldn't worry about whether you've got your job or not. Because if you get fired and you're worried about it, you're going to be upset. If you're not worried about being fired, you'll never be upset. You shouldn't worry about being rich. You might lose all your money. Don't worry about riches. You can't control that. You could try to, but you're crazy to worry about it or even to think much about it, because it can be taken away from you. You should think about the things you can control. And some of these philosophers went into great detail, and they said, look, what can you control? You can control whether you want something or not. You can control whether you think something is right or not. You can control whether you think an action is moral or not. You can control whether you think something is true or not. Those are the things you should be concerned about. And many philosophers said those are the only things you should be concerned about. So if somebody robs your house, doesn't bother you, you're not worried about that. Somebody, somebody's mean to you and says a snide thing to you, don't worry about that. Somebody treats you badly, don't worry. Those are not things you can control. You can only control yourself. This is a view that many Stoics had, and many people today think, well, that's kind of a harsh way to live, kind of unpleasant and not very joyful. But, they kind of had a point that there are some things, if you can't control it, you shouldn't get hugely anxious about it. And that provides a kind of inner peace. That was their view. Eudaimonia was the standard view among all the philosophical schools. And some of them thought, some were kind of eclectic. They thought, well, you ought to do all this. You ought to live a virtuous life, and you should seek simple pleasures, and you shouldn't worry about things you can't control. All of that seems to many people today to be very self-centered. You mean your morality is based basically on how content you're going to be? Well, what about others? And it certainly can be that, but the point to emphasize is that eudaimonia was understood by most of these philosophers to be enjoyed within a community. And that for you to be content, other people had to be content. And so it was in your interest to promote the well-being of others, at least others who had something to do with you. And so it was simply assumed that, of course, you're going to be friendly with people. You're going to help people in need who are near to you, your friends, your family, and that will make your life better as well. When I think about ancient Christian contributions to how to live, there are certain points that come to mind. You write many books on this thing. One thing I'll point out, though, is that Christians did redefine what community meant. At least Jesus did. In the Greek and Roman world, you were to treat well the people you were connected with, your friends, your family, people on your same socioeconomic status, maybe even all the citizens of your city. Jesus thought you're supposed to treat everybody well, not just those close to you, not just family, not just friends, even strangers, and not just people on your socioeconomic class. Everybody, especially the poor. Christianity emphasized a kind of altruism, where, you shouldn't be thinking about yourself. You should treat others at least as well as yourself. You shouldn't be selfish and self-centered and self-aggrandizing. You shouldn't be egotistical. You should be altruistic. Giving to others should be your priority. I'll say that ultimately that idea of morality, where you don't worry about how much you have, but you worry about supplying the needs of others, within the Christian tradition, ultimately that was rooted in an understanding of deferred gratification. This is kind of a downside. Sell all you have so that you can have treasures in heaven, says Jesus. So you're supposed to help those in need, but it's so you'll have treasures in heaven. In other words, you're living for the afterlife rather than for this life. That's a part of Christian ethics that I'm not particularly fond of, because I don't think then you're not actually loving somebody for what you can give them. You're loving them for what you can get out of it. The value of Christianity for me, I think that I tend to have, look, I'm not a good follower of Jesus. Let me just put that out there, but I do like the idea that I should be good, should be kind, not only to people close to me, but to everyone. I like the Christian mythology of good and evil. By mythology, I don't mean something that's made up or false in the kind of traditional sense. I mean the understanding of the world that helps it make sense to us. The world makes sense to me in light of good and evil. There are good forces in the world and there are evil forces in the world, and I want to promote one of those forces and oppose the other set of forces. And if you say, well, if there's no God, you can't have good and evil. Well, really? I know people say that all the time, but why not? Well, because God has to decide. Well, why does God have to decide what's good and evil? Why can't I decide what I think is good and evil? Many people say, just like they say there's only one ethical, you've got to have objective criteria for how to behave. There's only one objective way of doing what's right. Some people say you have to have an objective good or there can't be any good. And I think they're just making stuff up. They convince themselves of that, but it's absolutely not true. I don't believe in objective goods per se. I think some things are good and some things are bad. It's good when I have a nice sirloin steak for dinner, and it's bad when I'm eating fried liver. I'm just telling you, one's good and one's bad. We say, well, yeah, but there's no objective criterion. Yeah, I know, but I think some things are good. Kindness, gentleness, generosity are good. Well, you have no reason to think that. I'm sorry, I think it. Plato had an interesting view about this. Plato points out that some people say that things are good because they are supported by the gods. Plato asked, is something good because a god says so, or does a god say so because it's good? I think it's certainly the latter. If you have divine affirmation of good, it's because the good exists independently and the divine being is affirming it. It is good. The obvious failure of objective claims is the same thing with good and evil as it is with morality. Good and evil in any kind of metaphysical sense is that different people have different senses of it. And having some claim that objectively, I know that this thing is good and that thing is bad is empirically shown to be false because different people who claim the same objective truths have different views of what is good and what is evil. My own hierarchy of values. I'm just speaking personally here. What do I think is of ultimate importance? I myself, and let me say, I'm not urging you to share this. Be happy if you did, but just my view. I am a humanist. I think the human race is the highest value there is. I think the humans have priority in all of our ethical decisions. Not just our relatives, not just our friends, not just people we like. I think all of the humans. There are lots of philosophers who think that that is narrow-minded and that we should include the whole animal kingdom. I have problems with that view. I'm not a philosopher. I'm not able to argue it at any great length philosophically, but I will point out that there are living creatures that humans harm all the time simply by being humans. It's one thing to say that we should treat all the animals with human rights. Well, what about all the plants? Well, they're different. Well, so are the animals. And even if you say all the animals, do you ever swat a mosquito? Well, that doesn't really count. Okay, well, why do dogs count, but mosquitoes don't? Well, they just do. So people have different judgments, and there are philosophical, like serious arguments, apart from what I'm doing now, that for my view is that the human is to be given priority, and so my priority is to helping humans. How do I know that that's the way to behave, or that's the way to that is the greatest good? Well, I don't know in the sense that there's some kind of logical proof. I don't think that valuing the good is a matter of coming up with a syllogism that proves it, or a mathematical equation. You can't do it with a linear equation. I was born having a sense of what I thought was right and wrong. As I've developed those views. I've read what philosophers and other thinkers say about it, and I've come to decisions about what I think is right and wrong and what is good and evil. My epistemology is that I can't prove it, and either can you, and we may disagree, but I hope we agree that humans should have priority in our thinking about what it means to live and to live well and to live a good life. How can we have meaning and purpose with a life of this kind of morality when we're concerned about other humans, rather than thinking exclusively or thinking at all about a divine being in the world? Can you have mortal meaning and purpose without an immortal being and immortality? My view is that the answer is absolutely Yes, you can. And I know that you can because I do. And so it's not of much use for me to have a Christian apologist telling me that I can't have meaning and purpose. I can't? Huh. Well, if something happens, it is possible. And in fact, I do have meaning and purpose. My secular view is that this world is completely material. It came into existence. Our known universe came into existence with the Big Bang. Life came into being through material means. And being human means being a material creature. We are different from other creatures. All creatures are different from one another. We are definitely different in some rather noticeable and important ways. And for us to lead meaningful and purposeful lives means to understand what it means to be human and to live accordingly. With that view, with my secular view, I will readily admit that I have three big unanswered questions and roughly an infinity of smaller unanswered questions. The three big questions that I cannot answer and do not know how to answer, but that I think possibly at some point we will have an answer to, are these. I've been talking about the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago. How'd that happen? I don't know. You can read the physicists, the astrophysicists, the cosmologists, and the people have theories. People have ideas. They don't all agree with each other. But and so don't ask me what was happening before the Big Bang. It's a nonsensical question. It's like, if you're at the most northern part of the world, you're at the North Pole, at a precise point of the North Pole, what happens when you go north? You can't go north. What happens before the Big Bang? There wasn't a big thing before the Big Bang. How could something come from nothing? Well, some philosophers and physicists say that, in fact, something can come from nothing. Or maybe there was something before. I don't know. I don't have an answer. How did life begin? I don't know how life began. I mean, yes, it's a mystery, and people have their theories. Lots of people have lots of you may have scientific understandings that will disagree with other people's scientific understanding about how life began, but, it began. I don't know how. How do we have consciousness? By God, I wish I knew. I don't know. Of course, lots of books written about this, lots of really smart people out there. You got your David Chalmers in the world and your Daniel Dennett's in the world, and people write big books about how we have consciousness. They disagree with each other, and I'm just a peon. I don't know how I have consciousness, but I think I do. I can't answer those questions. Believers sometimes tell me that since you don't have answers to those questions, then your view can't be right because it began all with God. Life created God, and God gave us consciousness. That's how it all began. You don't have answers, and we do. But of course, they can't answer where God began and how God came into existence and how God is conscious. Well, they have an unmoved mover. The fact we don't know things does not mean that our basic view is wrong. Ignorance and truth. I don't have any idea how quantum mechanics works. They tell me it does. It makes no sense to me. And people tell me I'm wrong about this, but I've read the books where scientists who do quantum mechanics say they don't understand it either. They know it works. They have some idea of how it works, but they don't understand it. The fact they don't understand it doesn't mean it's not true. I don't understand how my toaster works. I mean, I really don't. I do not understand how it works. I mean, you plug it in and many of you do understand. I don't. The fact I don't understand it doesn't mean that it's not true. My toaster does work. We did begin. We do have life. We do have consciousness, and I don't know how. 200 years ago, they didn't know how molecules worked. It didn't mean there weren't molecules. They didn't know what they were. By the way, even in the ancient world, Epicureans believed in atoms. They didn't know what they were, but they believed in them. So anyway, my view is that we are ultimately finite beings. And as finite beings, we're here for a little while and then we're going to go. Is it possible to be happy as a finite being? For me, this was the big irony. I didn't think, or I didn't know whether I could find meaning in life, knowing that this life is all there is. I just couldn't imagine how I could find meaning and purpose in life, and didn't think it could exist. I'd just become a nihilist. I'd just become depressed. I'd just become despondent. I'd have no reason to live. And oh boy, was that wrong. I'm happier now than I ever was. And I have more meaning in life than I ever did. Why? Precisely because I think this life is short and it's all there is. Why does that make me happy? Because I don't think this life is a dress rehearsal for something else. I don't think this is the practice round. I think this is it. And that means I want to relish it as much as I can for as long as I can, because there's nothing after this. Happiness means grabbing life and relishing it. And for me, as a human being with my DNA, I feel like I have to help other people to help them enjoy life, or I'm not being fully human. I'm being inhuman. And so, trying to enjoy life, trying to find my own eudaimonia, and trying to help others do so is what brings happiness and meaning to my life. Finitude and mortality are not depressing for me at all. They're liberating. I'm not afraid of misbehaving because I'll be punished later or worried about my afterlife. I'm enjoying life as much as I can. I wasn't depressed before I existed. I won't be depressed after I existed. I wasn't depressed before, and I definitely can be happy now. How do I know I can be happy now? Because I'm usually happy now. And so there it is. This life is all there is. It's not a preparation for what comes next. But it is a very big sin, using the term metaphorically, to become solipsistic, to focus on yourself and yourself alone, like you're the only one who exists and you're the only one who matters. If you do that, maybe you're staying true to your DNA, but I don't think so. You certainly would not be true to my DNA, because I don't think we can be happy as self-centered creatures. We need each other. So let me get personal and tell you how I think we should live. Why not? I'll tell you my view about this. How then shall we live? I think we should strive for eudaimonia, for living happily. I believe in bodily happiness. I believe in the simple pleasures of life, of finding simple pleasures. I believe in good drink and good food. I believe in doing the things that bring me pleasure in life without doing anybody else harm, and I enjoy bodily pleasure. But I think excess is a huge mistake, not just because of the hangover or the drug addiction, but because it takes you away from other pleasures that you can have. If you focus just on bodily pleasure, how different are you from an animal who just wants to be pleased all the time physically? You're a human being. And so you need to have other pleasures, and really extreme pleasure can take you away from pleasures of the mind. You should have it. My view is we should have an intellectual life. We've been given a mind. We should use our mind and think big thoughts and think deep thoughts and engage in intellectual reflection. We should not be brainless blobs who sit on the couch and watch 10 hours of soaps every day or sitcoms and just don't have any thoughts in our head. Many people are simply material blobs of emotion and thoughtlessness who get through life and, they don't think about it. I just think that's a horrible way to live a life, and it's not being fully human. I don't believe in an actual soul, But I do think that there are things inside of me that aren't simply kind of intellectual and rational and not simply kind of bodily pleasure. I, for one, think that there's such a thing as beauty. And when I think of beauty, when I experience beauty in any form, for me, it brings a kind of satisfaction. And for me, beauty is in all sorts of forms. For me, Renoir is probably my favorite artist. Mozart is probably my favorite musician. And I like watching the NFL. I'm sorry, it's beautiful. The athletes are amazing. I experience beauty in numbers of ways. Nature, I especially think is beautiful. I don't think indifference to our surroundings is very good. I think that we should live not just for ourselves, for others, that promotes our well-being and theirs. I think we should love one another. We should be generous to others. We should be kind to one another, and we should relish our existence. Let me end with my personal recipe. I'll tell you what I do for these things. These are the things I do. I stress family. I love my family. I'm guilty of not loving them enough practically, as many people are, but I just love my family. I'm into my family. I adore my family. Sarah, especially, my kids, especially, grandkids. Can you believe I have 6 grandkids? Family, friends, I really love having close friends. Personally, I don't like having 8 million kind of semi-friends. I like having close friends. I have deep conversations, and I really enjoy, personally, deep conversations about interesting and important topics. I don't like cocktail parties where it's just small talk the whole time. If I'm at a cocktail party, I try to corner somebody and have a real conversation. When I'm with my family, 14 family members over here in England, I like to get one-on-one with people and have a deep conversation. That's just what I like. I like to read, not schlock, not pure entertainment. I like to read serious books. Many modern books, but also especially 19th century novels, George Eliot, Charles Dickens, Anthony Trollope. I just love reading serious books that make me think and understand more what it means to be human. I like thinking. I do a lot of thinking. Oh boy, do I think a lot. I like meditating. I have a meditation practice that I engage in every day, 20 minutes this morning, meditate. Various ways of doing it. It makes a huge difference in my life. I love being in nature. Love being outside. I love hiking. I love walking through the woods. I love seeing streams. Mountains. The beach. I just love nature. I love to travel. You can travel even if you don't have a lot of money. You don't have to go, you can just travel outside your town and find every city I've ever been in, every town I've been in has places of beauty. You just have to look for them. You should have enjoyable work. Well, man, if you don't have enjoyable work, I've got enjoyable work. I love my work. But even when I had unenjoyable jobs, I would always try to find something interesting in it, something that I could throw myself into. And for me, that worked, even when I was doing things that, oh my God, that were not seen as enjoyable. I believe in having a good sense of humor and a good sense of self-humor. That helps me enjoy life and not take it too seriously and not take myself too seriously. I really think we need to appreciate others. We need to appreciate the people around us. We need to appreciate where we are. We need to appreciate our senses and what we experience. We need to appreciate the world that we're in. We need to appreciate more than we do. Do I think that all of this contributes to us opposing religion? No, I do not believe in opposing religion. I think religion is a human cultural form that, like other human cultural forms, is problematic. I don't participate in religion myself, but I don't think that opposition to religion makes me happy or anyone else happy, and so I just don't do it. I say what I think, I don't do it. Common goals and different paths. I end with this quickly. We all have a different context. We're all different human beings. We all have different people around us, family, friends, workers, places we live, situations, ways we were brought up. We're all different. So we can't all have the same path. We all have different beliefs. Nobody believes exactly what I do about everything. No one believes what you do about everything. We all have deep commitments. All of us have deep commitments. And I think I'm a big believer in deep commitments, and yours won't be the same as mine. But I really believe in appreciating the other, whether that person is Christian or non-Christian, whether that person is Jewish or Muslim, whether the person is American or Mexican or from Uruguay or from North Korea or from Russia or China. I think we need to appreciate the other who is different from us. Not approve of them necessarily, but at least try to understand them and appreciate them. And I think we should fight what we consider to be evil. There are evil powers in the world, not cosmic powers. There's a lot of evil around us, and it don't look like it's getting any better. And we should fight evil in order to promote the good. I think starvation is an evil. I think oppression is an evil. I think evil. I think homelessness is an evil. I think ignorance is an evil. War is an evil. I think we should fight for what we believe is good. And above all, I think we should seek the truth. If we seek the truth and we're sure that the truth cannot lie, then we will live a better life. That does not come simply by sitting around. It involves thinking and reading and talking and meditating and doing what you think is right. All right. Well, thank you. I've enjoyed being with you. I hope these have been of some use. They've been of use to me.